here and in the room. Thanks, Sergio. So as Pete went over, but I'm going to briefly repeat it for the folks online. You're all looking at the agenda. We're going to start with some technical information, but we really wanted to spend a majority of the day hearing from people out in Oregon who are actually using virtual fence. We've been told there's a really steep learning curve. And so reflecting on some of those lessons together, hearing about creative ways that private livestock producers have been partnering with other organizations, federal agencies, a soil and water conservation district, to actually make this work on kind of mixed ownership landscapes that characterize a lot of Eastern Oregon. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our first technical speaker, Dr. David Bonert. He's a OSU professor, and he's the director of the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center in Burns and also Union. And he's going to give us a summary of the products and systems available, and then highlight resources and where you can find them.
Okay, thank you, Katie. And for people that know me being technical, oh boy. But no, we'll talk a little bit about this is what I wanted to lead off with today is just kind of set the table for those of you that may not be familiar with the technology really well. I mean, it has been around for a number of years already. But what we're going to try to do is outline a little bit about what the technology is and how we're using it and what some of the opportunities are, and then some resources that if it's something that you're interested in, that you'll be able to look at moving forward. Maybe. There we go. Now we got it. Okay, I was going the wrong way. So this isn't a new technology. It has been around for a while. Here on the left, some of the early attempts at virtual fencing were a lot like what you see with your dogs now. A lot of them were proximity sensing, where you had the wire buried in the ground, and when the dog got close to it, it would shock them and try to keep them in unless they were a stubborn dog, and then would go across, and they do all that. We tried that with cattle a number of years ago, even at the experiment station in Union. And climate and environmental conditions and the number of towers that we required, it had potential that we could see, but the technology didn't allow us to really work well. It didn't, technology hadn't caught up to the idea yet of how we were going to do it. And then over here on the right-hand side, you can see that contraption on that cow's head. That was done down in New Mexico. Dean Anderson started looking at virtual fencing back in the 80s. And he's, at least to my knowledge, he's probably the person that's really pushed this forward over the decades, and where it's gotten to the point where now it's a much smaller product that I think you'll see probably some pictures today, and there's also some other information about actually what these virtual fence collars look like. They're not like that now of the way it would be, but it's not new technology. The concept and the proof that they work has been there for years. It's just cost too much, and the technology didn't allow it to be put on a large number of animals and used across the landscape. So how does it work? It really works with behavioral modification, and by that they're getting a cue, and be an audio cue or electrical cue that will let that animal know they're not supposed to be in a location that they're not supposed to be. And you train them to do that. It happens fairly quickly. Most of the training, for those of you that haven't done it, you can usually get your training done in a couple of days, 2 or 3 days. And most of the time, the training's going to be adequate. I know there's some folks that actually don't do training. And I know it's recommended that it be done, but that collar will work. I mean, the collar will actually get them to respect it, and as they learn where they should or should not be based on the audio or electrical cue that they're getting. The virtual fencing, some of the things that make it attractive, it's less logistically challenging. I mean, the thing about a hard fence is good, and it'll work, but once it's there, you're not going to move it too much unless you've got electric fence, and then that's got the challenges associated with it. But with the virtual fence, it's where you're going to draw it, understanding the topography and understanding cattle movement and cattle behavior and what affects their distribution. It can be less labor intensive, especially when you're working on the fencing. Gives you a lot of flexibility on how you can manage your cattle. And one of the side benefits that a lot of people, especially with the fire season we just had, really appreciated was the cattle location and tracking that it gets, even beyond the use of it as a virtual fence tool in order to keep cattle in or out of a certain area. It can actually be used to give you relatively real-time locations of your animals and where they're at, how you can manage it. And then, and I put cost effective, but I put situation dependent, and that's going to be dependent on each individual operation and how it's going to work and what your cost shares are and how everything works. But I think that's one area that we need to do a lot more work on, is actually getting the economics of this figured out and where some of the break evens are. But I think there's a lot of people using it now, and there is some economic benefit and some environmental services benefit to the product. So how does it work? If you look down here at the bottom, if you really think about of this screen, we think about how the virtual fence technology works. You're going to keep cattle in, or you're going to keep cattle out of an area. Think of a riparian in that scenario. And in order to do that, we use the virtual fence technology. We can actually draw the boundaries where we want them to be or where we don't want them to be, and utilize it to set the animals up to be successful. The components that we use primarily, you've got a satellite or a GPS, okay? That satellite is then going to talk to one of the devices that we have on the animal. Most of what we have are collars. There are some that are ear tags that are out there, but there's a receiver in that collar that can talk to the satellite and finds out where it's at on the earth, okay, where we're located. Then we have the cloud, or a data management system or software that'll talk, and then a computer system that'll talk to that cloud. And these are pretty common between any of the systems that we're going to use. Where the differences arise is how those communications occur between the different products that we may have. There's some that the computer or your smartphone can talk with the internet, basically, when we're talking about the cloud, can talk to that device that's on the animal, then with the satellite, and it can work that way. This has a tremendous amount of potential, but it also requires cell coverage or satellite coverage. And that may not work for everybody, okay? The other option is if you have what's called a communication gateway or a tower, okay? And the way that system works, everything's the same other than the cloud or the internet, the cell coverage or Wi-Fi can talk to that communication gateway or tower, and then the tower can have line of sight communication with the device that's on the animal, okay? Works a lot like a walkie-talkie from that standpoint, if you send it, or a two-way radio. What that can do is if you have cell coverage where you put your tower can then give you coverage down into areas or across areas that don't have cell coverage, okay? That's for real-time access. Most all this technology doesn't require real-time access, even though that's a wonderful tool that comes with these products. You can upload your virtual fences into the collars before you put them on or while they're on the cattle. And then even if you don't know where your cattle are real-time based on your computer, those virtual fences will still be working because it's been uploaded to that collar and the information that's on your collar. So they'll work even without the communication gateway or the cell coverage if the information has been uploaded into that collar. The problem would be you just don't know real time where your animals are. Okay. Okay, so what are some of the opportunities that are out there? And this is some work on the right that I'll show you, talk about here in just a minute. But pasture rotation, cattle herding, that's one of the things, one of the big tools that's used right now for a lot of it. Cattle location and monitoring, that's important. And I'll take just a second and talk about this. These are two screenshots I took off my phone from a forest allotment where we were grazing cattle. And I think you can see the time. This was at 8:13 in the morning. That was at 8:19 at night. I called the range rider because I'm like, those cattle should not be out. You can see on the upper portion of it, somebody had left a gate open. It was, I don't know if it was a hunter, I don't know if it was a recreationist, or it was us, one of the two. Somebody left the gate down. The cattle pushed the gate down. And I could see that the cattle were out and heading north. I called the range rider. Range rider went up, found it, And by that evening, we'd gotten the cattle back in because more cattle had went out by the time we were there. You can see potentially in this type of an environment, if I wouldn't have had that real-time access, it would have taken a lot longer to get those cattle in and for us to know where they were. So there was that benefit I didn't have because it was a hard fence. I didn't have virtual fence set up on that end. That was another option that I could have done, except a hard fence, I would have accepted it to work. The virtual fence is what we would use in the middle and to keep them in certain areas. We can use landscapes for grazing restriction, especially post-fire with some of the fires that we've had. And I think Chad's going to talk a little bit about that next, about some of the advantages we there. So I don't want to get into that too much. Targeted grazing for fuels reduction. I think Chad will talk a little bit about some work we've done there as well. The next speaker. Invasive plant control. We can also protect sensitive areas from overutilization, such as riparian areas or endangered plants. I know we've got a project going on the East Moraine right now where we're looking at trying to protect Spalding's catchfly locations. We're using virtual fence in order to do that for culturally significant plants. And then also it can support wildlife migration and management if we don't have to have those fences in certain areas, or we can reduce those interior fences. That's going to benefit wildlife migration and management. So that's basically what I wanted to give you on the technology. And now I wanted to shift, oh, Katie, sorry, 5 minutes? Okay. Wanted to shift base real quick and talk a little bit about the Rangelands Gateway. And this is the website. It's on the agenda. You can see, and we'll go over it at the break, I believe. We'll pull this up if anybody wanted to see it. It's a wonderful resource that has a ton of partners on it that provide it's probably the best location you're going to find for the most up-to-date information you can find on virtual fence. And it's on the agenda that we have. This is some of the information that's there. I did a couple of screenshots from this yesterday. Frequently asked questions, the basics, you can read as well as I can. I don't want to go through that, but during the break, if anybody wants to see it, you can come up and we'll go through some of this with you. One of the things that's really nice in there, because this is probably answers 90% of the questions we get about virtual fence, and it's in the handout. If you didn't pick it up, it's over on the table. There's really 4 primary products available right now for virtual fence. You've got eShepherd from Gallagher, Halter, No Fence, and Vents. And this is put together in January of 2025 with as recent of information as we could get, looking at the software, how it's used, the type of base station if they need one, the collar, is it solar or battery driven by itself? What's the life expectancy? Herd size that's typically used for each one, pasture size, upfront costs, and then yearly costs and how it could go. There's just a really nice summary of information of the various products without getting into the individually. That's not really what we're here today to talk about here, even though I know it's probably important to a lot of folks, but it's more about the technology and how it can be used, because each of these has its benefits and potential challenges. And with that, that's what I've got before I turn it over to Chad. So I think we're going to take questions after this initial session. So if you got any questions for me, keep them tight, and I will switch it over to Chad. So thank you.
Thanks, David. No, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My name is Chad Boyd. I'm the research leader with the Agricultural Research Service in Burns, co-located with Dave. And what I've been asked to talk about today are some common questions and lessons learned as regards virtual fencing. It's not going to be comprehensive. Really what I'm trying to do is to kind of get everybody's brains thinking about some of the issues, some of the opportunities, answer a few common questions, and hopefully we can get into that in more detail in the panels this afternoon. I'll also say that I will be around all day long, so feel free to grab me and we can go out into the hall if you have questions. So I'm going to start things off with questions. The most basic question we get is, does this stuff actually work? It's a good question. It's why we got into it. It's why we got interested. Like David said, the dog fences, yeah, they can work sometimes. Does this actually work on cattle? Yes, but there's a comma but after that. This is not a joystick. It's not something you're going to pinpoint move animals around the landscape. It's not driving a speedboat. Think about captaining a cruise ship, right? So we're making suggestions, hoping that we get the right behavioral modifications from the cows. It's going to be more effective on some cows than others. Typically, when we do a study, we'll find, I don't know, 10%, 8 to 10% of our cows just seem not to respond quite as well as the remaining cows. So it's not going to be as effective on every single cow. It's not going to be 100% effective on every single cow. More often than not, if we're getting undesired results, we can trace it back to something we did wrong. The basic technology works. It's beeps, it's shocks that communicate, do this, don't do that to an animal. That's pretty simple. But figuring out all of the tricks from the human end. No, don't have an angle, have a rounded corner, things like that. Don't put a cross fence on a downslope. That's not going to interrupt the direction of travel of a cow. The human factor is huge in this, and there is a learning curve. And we're going to talk about some other factors as we go along here. Another question we get is has to do with physiological stress on the animals, but also behaviorally. If you turn a virtual fence off, what happens next? Do the cattle remember where that's at? And Juliana Ranches has led some work on both of those questions. And on the first question, the physiological stress, she looked at different blood indicators associated with stress or inflammatory responses in cows. And she did that by taking blood on day 0, putting the collars on the cows, and then 5 days later she took blood again and looked for changes in the blood profiles. Basically no response. So I would say from the existing data out there, this seems to be neutral in terms of animal welfare, stressing the animals out. In terms of how long that memory of the virtual fence lingers in that cow's mind, not very. It tends to fade as soon as you turn the fence off. In the study that Juliana did, she had a feed attractant at one end of the corral. She puts the cows in there. There's a virtual fence between where she put them in and the alfalfa. They hit the virtual fence, they back off. She does another run where she turns the fence off. If the fence is off, the cattle go right to the alfalfa. So they tend not to institutionalize where these fences are at, which can be a good thing, right? Another question we get quite frequently is, do you have to collar the whole herd? My answer to that would be yes, but there's an asterisk on that as well. All of the adult animals, I would have them collared, except for the bulls. There's variable luck on keeping cows on bulls. It depends on who you talk to. But all the mama cows, if I was running cow calves, I would put them on all of the cows. Collars are currently not available, to my knowledge, for calves. It would require an expanding collar so that you don't get into an animal welfare issue, cutting off oxygen for the calf. And that's relevant because it kind of goes to this question of, do you have to collar the whole herd? So we did a study. I'll talk a little bit about it as we go along. We were trying to graze a fuel break out at our research range with virtual fencing to confine the animals. We had dry cows and we had paired cows. And the line I want to look at is this black line. That's the percentage of the day that the cows spent where we wanted them to be in the fuel break instead of outside the fuel break. And if you look at dry cows, we were up near 100% over a 30-day trial period. Look at mama cows. We started out pretty good, and then we really start to taper off. Part of that is declining forage availability, but the dry cows didn't leave, right? Part of it is calves getting bored, and they're not collared, so they go outside of the boundaries. What does mama do? Mama's going to follow them out. So be aware that try to collar all your adult animals, but be aware that calves are going to have an influence on the behavior of the adult cows, of the mama cows. Okay, some lessons learned, and there's quite a few and growing, right? We're still learning. If you quit learning when you're using virtual fence, you probably shouldn't be using virtual fence. It's a learning process, and it's going to continue, and you're going to get better at it. So I like to think of virtual fencing and other precision ag tools as just that. They're tools. And I don't have an opinion on tools. I'm not pro hammer or anti screwdriver, right? This is a tool just like a hammer's a tool, and hammers don't get interesting until we give them a job. So think of this as a tool and think of your management objective and whether or not you need to use that tool. Don't use virtual fencing just because it's too much effort. Use it for a specific reason that's related to a management objective. What are some of the management contexts where we often use virtual fencing? Large landscapes with limited interior fencing. We have a lot of those in eastern Oregon. In interior fencing that's not in quite the right location for your management objectives, or maybe we have sub-pasture management objectives. In our fuel break, we did a fuel break study that's a good example of that. These are virtual fences. The white is an audio boundary. The red is a shock zone. And this gray area is where we wanted to graze a fuel break. It's about 200 yards wide. It's about 2 miles long, okay? We didn't have interior fences to help us do that. This is the actual perimeter fence in green here going around the pasture. That's a hardwire 5-strand barbed wire fence. So we needed to divide up that pasture in order to get that fuel break grazed. Virtual fencing was a really good fit for that. And also post-wildfire applications. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's a group in Gillum County now that had hundreds of miles of fence burn up. And what do you do next when barbed wire fencing costs 30 grand a mile up from there, depending on topography? Virtual fencing may be a way to help get you back on the ground, get your cattle back on the ground and you up and running again. Another lesson learned is to think about what management success looks like. With virtual fencing, it's almost as if you've been given a blank canvas. Okay, this ranch that you've had that's maybe been in your family for 4 or 5 generations, and these are the pastures. Those don't have to exist when you have virtual fencing. So really think about what does management success look like without necessarily thinking about management traditions that are based on permanent fencing. This opens the doors for you to rethink your management strategy. Thinking about where, when, and how much grazing you're going to need to meet a specific management objective. So don't feel bound. It helps us not to feel bounded by permanent fences, allows us to look at the same landscape, again, maybe we've been looking at for generations, in a new way. Another lesson learned is there's a difference between what we call efficacy and what we call success. Okay, and this is really important. Efficacy is the percent of the time that the cows are going to be within the desired area. Okay, success is whether or not you're meeting your management objective. You don't necessarily need 100% efficacy to meet your management objectives, but sometimes you do. So let's look at examples of both. I wouldn't recommend perimeter fencing, frankly, with virtual fencing, particularly if we're next to a highway. But if we were next to a highway, we would want efficacy of the technology to be 100% to meet the management objective of not getting cows hit on the road, right? We'd need that. Riparian areas are another more practical, more common example of that. If we're trying to keep cattle out of a riparian area, we don't want grazing in a riparian area. It only takes a few cattle to do a lot of grazing in a riparian area, particularly late in the season when it's hot and they want to camp and stay there, right? So we might want efficacy, the effectiveness of the technology to be 100% in order to meet that management objective. But that's not always the case. In our fuel break study, our goal was to have 50% utilization of fine fuels within the fuel break. We hit that goal. Our efficacy was not 100%. We actually had about 5% utilization in the larger pasture surrounding the fuel break because those mama cows were breaking out. That's okay. We hit our fuels management reduction goal. The fact that we had some cows get out really didn't matter, particularly because they were contained by a perimeter hard fence. In the very first study that we ever did with virtual fencing, this was the Does This Actually Work study, we looked at using virtual fence to keep cattle out of areas that were burned, okay, which could come into play, does come into play on BLM allotments. If you get a portion of a pasture that burns, you either have to hard fence it or stay out of the whole pasture. So we said, could you use virtual fencing to keep them out of the burn piece? And in that case, we didn't have 100% efficacy. The cattle were not in the unburned 100% of the time, but we were able to limit utilization to about 3% in the burned area here in the foreground. This is the unburned in the background. And this was prescribed burn, by the way. So this is the spring after a fall prescribed burn. Only utilized about 3%. That's not enough utilization to limit the recovery of that burned area. So we were pretty happy with that. Bigger can be better when it comes to virtual fencing. And what I mean by that, it all comes back to simple math. The perimeter to area ratio, as it decreases, animals are going to come into contact with fences less. So if you take a simple example, a section of ground, and you add up the yards of perimeter fencing for every acre, you're going to have about 11 yards of perimeter fencing for every acre. If we go down to a quarter section, 160 acres, we're looking at double that, about 22 yards of fencing per acre. So per acre contained within. So if we had the same stocking rate, think the number of animals per animal unit or relative to animal unit months, same stocking rate, the animals in this pasture, this bigger pasture, are going to come into contact with fences a lot less than the animals in the smaller pasture. So all other things being equal, and that's a big statement, a bigger pasture can be easier to use with virtual fencing, which is sort of counterintuitive. We actually started small because our reasoning was if we had a rec, we wanted a small rec. It can actually get easier in bigger pastures. So just a couple of more points here. You got to know your landscape. You got to think like a cow. And I've got on the bullet objectives may differ between managers and cows. Does that ever happen? Yeah, it happens a little bit. So try not to let that happen. Here's an example of different objectives between the manager and the cows. This was a targeted fuel reduction project. And we had really high buildup of fine fuels that had been building up over time. They were pretty dry. And this particular chunk of ground on our research range outside of Burns, we wanted to use grazing and virtual fencing because this area is not hard fenced to reduce those fuels by at least 50%. That was our management goal. So we dumped the cattle into this red area. This happens to be a playa that very rarely holds water. In the year we did the study, it held water, right? We had a good snow year the previous winter. What did the cows do? This was in July. We were supplying water. We were actually hauling water to this pasture where we wanted the cows to stay, but they wanted to go over here and stand knee deep in this playa. They wanted to stand in the mud and cool off. So if we would have thought like a cow, what we would have done to begin with is change this polygon and made the boundary inclusive of that playa. That wouldn't have hurt us at all, but we didn't do that. And because we didn't do that, we spent a lot of time herding cows back into the virtual fence area, and it took us a lot longer than it should have to reach that 50% utilization goal in the area where we wanted to reduce the fuels. So know your landscape, think like a cow. In the last two slides, mindset matters, and it matters a lot. It matters for the manager, and it matters for the cow. So let's look at the manager mindset first. We want to set our cows up for success. That is our goal, to me, as a manager, if we're using virtual fence. We're going to look for every opportunity we can to do that, and that starts with the management objective. Here's an example of not doing that, of not setting our cows up for success, and we learned from this, right? We did a project, David led it, at the Hall Ranch in Northeast Oregon, and this is Meadow Creek, and we were trying to keep the cows out of Meadow Creek, and this is a heat map of cow locations. The darker the color, the more the cattle were located there. And what we did is we had a fence that was fairly near the riparian area. It was actually in this meadow along the riparian area, and it worked to an extent, but we could have done better. How could we have done better? We could have done better by having the management objective, not of keeping the cows out of the riparian area, but keeping the cows in the uplands. And if that were our management objective, what we would have done is we would have put a virtual fence right here at the edge of the uplands, and the cows would have never gotten the meadow. They would have been farther from the creek to begin with. They would have smelled it less. They wouldn't have been able to see it as well, and we would have probably had better success, right? So set your cows up for success at every opportunity that you can. And lastly, cow mindset matters. If a cow is in a fear state, what's it thinking about? It's thinking about survival, and we've all been there. This is the one that's going to plow us when we're in the working chutes, right? I've seen cattle that were in a fear state interact with a virtual fence. Virtual fence does not work on cattle that are in a fear state. So we don't want that, right? And if you think about it, what we're trying to do with virtual fencing, it almost sounds impossible. What we're trying to do is take what's in our head, a thought that's in our head, use the electronics that Dave talked about to go through the cloud into the cow's head, implant that idea, and make it to where the cow thought it was its own idea to begin with, right? And then when it hears a beep or gets a shock, it makes the decision that's in line with our management objective. If that cow is in a fear state, it won't do that, right? It won't do that. So cow mindset matters. What does that mean? It means that we need to think about what we're doing when we're hauling cows or pushing cows into a virtual fence pasture. How are we herding them? What state of mind are they in? How are we settling those cows once we get them into the pasture so that they're not in that fear state, they're in a calm state where they can actually make decisions versus react to their environment. And I can't say it any better than Ray Hunt. That was kind of his, if anybody who knows Ray Hunt in the room, or his later progeny, someone like Buck Brannaman. But the way Ray put it, and to me this is exactly what we're trying to do with virtual fencing, is when you ask your horse to do something, it should be his idea. He wants to do it, he understands how to do it, and he does it. That's what we're trying to do with virtual fencing, and that's why we need the cow in the mindset to be able to make those decisions. So that's what I got.
Yeah, for pause, handing up the mic. Thanks, Chad. We have a few minutes, about 5 minutes before our first panel. And so let's take a couple questions, perhaps one online, one in the room for David and Chad. As we're doing that, I'll ask our next panelists, so Rob and Lacey and Luke, to just come up here, get set up, and we'll transition from there. So any questions for David and Chad, online or here? They answered all your questions. Yeah, Kelly.
I'm just curious, when the cows leave the boundary and then they decide to come back for whatever reason, does the technology know that they are going from outside the vents to inside and not zap them, or are they going to, or get a beep?
Yeah, so let's see, they would have heard the question online, so I don't need to repeat it. Yeah, so the answer to that question is yes. The technology does know that. You can think of virtual fencing as a one-way gate. So if I'm a cow and we've got a virtual fence right here, I get shocked as I'm going out chasing my calf, but then I decide I need to go back to water within that virtually fenced area. I do not get penalized when I go back through the fence. When I go back through the fence, that collar is going to reset, and we get another chance to contain that animal. But also be aware that after I break out, there are safety protocols in place that will turn that collar off from an animal welfare standpoint. You don't want a mama cow out there getting shocked because it's outside of the fence. So there are boundaries on that too, limitations.
Real quick on that too, just to follow up. What Chad said is absolutely right, but one of the things that we learned this past year, at least us, when we started looking at that, especially when we've already set the fences up and we're trying to move cattle either into a pasture, for instance, or when we're trying to get them out of the riparian area back up to the upland. If you're not running perpendicular to that fence, depending on how quick the communication with the satellite and that collar is, and where the accuracy of the GPS collar, the collar may not know if it's going in or out. And so there can be some struggles with that, of animals getting shocked when we don't want them to be. So it gets back to what Chad said about understanding the cattle behavior, knowing the trails, set those entrance and exit areas up in a way that you can minimize the potential conflict with that virtual fence.
Set them up for success.
Yep.
Now, David and Chad, we do have a question from Eric Bernald online. How far from a riparian area does a virtual fence need to be in order so that it may be effective from you all's experience?
That's a good question. To me, you want to minimize the chance of sight and smell. That's from our perspective. We did that first study and we were like, oh, this technology is great. It's going to work. It's going to keep them out of the riparian area. If they can see the trees and the water and hear the water and smell the water, it's going to be a lot harder to keep them out than if they're in that upland that you've got. But in that case, again, you need to have water in the uplands in order for that to work. You have to set them up to be successful. If you don't have a spring or you don't have water that you can haul, it's going to be a struggle. I don't think there's any set distance that's the best. You want to minimize the potential interaction or the draw or that candy of the riparian area from the cattle. You want to minimize the distraction of the riparian area if you can.
Other questions here in the room? Well, thanks, Dustin and Chad. We
Thank
are
y'all.
going to transition to the next part of our agenda. So we have a panel planned with producers from Oregon who have actually been using virtual fence. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Pete Schrader, OSU Extension Agent from Wallowa County, and Dustin Johnson, the Rangeland Outreach Coordinator based out of Burns. And they're going to introduce their panel.
Okay, thank you, Katie. So yes, our first panel, if we could get Luke Morgan and Rob and Lacey Elder to sit in the hot seats there. So actually, they're not really hot. They're just orange. We'd appreciate that. So Dustin, how about if you use that mic for them so I don't have to pass this back and forth? How about we just start off with just a brief introduction of yourself and a little bit about how you're kind of engaged in the virtual fence, and then we'll talk more directly with some specific questions on how you're using it.
Luke Morgan, Lightning Bolt Cattle Company. We're using virtual fence on 2 different ranches we have. Most of them are both Forest Service allotments. And our main objectives kind of when we started was labor savings and then trying to keep some cattle out of riparian usage. The other big part of it was actually GPS capability. So that's where we kind of started.
Great, thank you. Yep.
My name is Lacey Elder. That's my dad, Rob. He can speak for himself here in a minute. Elder Ranch, we have several locations throughout Eastern Oregon. We're coloring all of our cattle. We use 2 different virtual fence companies. We can get into those questions later as well. We started using virtual fence mainly for the GPS location and labor savings. It has turned into more of a predator safety issue and then intensively grazing our cattle as well.
I'm Rob Elder.
Can't hear my too. Sorry.
Okay, we'll start over. Rob Elder, we've used Vince for 3 years and Halter for 1 year on both forest allotments and private ground. As Lacey said, one of our main goals was keeping track of the cattle, but we saw the potential in being able to do much more intensive grazing and use it for various things. As they've talked about, set them up for success, or you'll learn a lot in the process. And the learning curve is very steep there.
So I just wanted to mention that as we were planning this program, they're like, what job can we give Dustin that he can't screw up too much? And so I'm going to help Sergio monitor the chat. And I mentioned that because if Pete and I do this correctly, there's going to be time towards the end for all of you in the room to ask questions. So be thinking about those, and then online as well. So.
Thank you. All right, so we have kind of 3 questions that we're going to start out with, and we can build on those. You can add anything that you feel is pertinent and important. You touched on these a little, the first series of questions, but maybe we can revisit those in a little more detail for folks in the audience and online. And the first question is, for each of your operations, how have you been using virtual fence, and what have been your objectives? So like you said, you touched on those a little bit, but maybe a little bit more detail, especially following Chad's talk about the fact that objectives and your outcome are kind of tied really close together. So what were you thinking as you developed that plan? And then maybe after you've implemented this virtual fence, have those objectives changed? Do you think maybe there's something you would do different as you move forward in planning those kind of grazing scenarios?
So when we first started, it was mainly labor savings, riparian use, and then GPS capability. The first session we put it on the cattle, like the first 45 days, thank goodness I wrote them objectives down somewhere, because the first 45 days it worked way better than I ever thought it would. And it actually got me excited.
Sorry. Still not working? It's still not working. I'm sorry.
So we'll try that again. So we used the technology for the first 45 days, and it actually exceeded my expectations. So then I got excited and thought we could do more with it. And what actually ended up happening is then later on, when it started meeting the original objectives I had my hopes up already, and I had to go back and look at the wrote down objectives I originally had to make sure that it was still doing what we asked it to do. So that was kind of some of my challenges there at the end, but I do recommend writing down the objectives before you go into this process.
I'll agree with what Luke said. Our first objective was one, animal containment. We run on a lot of outside Forest Service, very heavy timber, no cell phone service whatsoever. So we had a lot of negatives to overcome before we could even really get started on it. It was really cool when we could go live, have all of our towers up. We could see exactly where the cattle were immediately. I'd be up in our cow camp. Like I said, we have to pack everything in and turn the generator on, have a Starlink Wi-Fi out there. I could pull up the computer, see everything. I'd call Dad, be like, well, I don't need to go right over here. Here's cattle. We're good. We're going to go work on this project. I'd get up the next morning, turn it on. I'd have 3 voicemails. Hey, your cows got out. It's 10 o'clock at night. You need to get over there first thing. So it was kind of fun to kind of bring cow camp into the 21st century. I got to play around with it quite a bit, especially about halfway through the season, and I joked with all of our neighbors I could sit in camp in my pajamas and move cows online, because there's a piece in there, especially through vents, where you can put a moving vents on cattle and move them and shift them. And that's literally how I got through that first summer. And that first year we did vents, it took our gathering from 3 months down to 2.5 weeks. We didn't have to hire any additional riders. We didn't have to hire a helicopter. We were clean. We had everything home. Bulls came home, cows came home. We were very happy with that. However, the learning curve and some of the other challenges, it's been fun. It's been a headache. There's been a lot of sleepless nights trying to figure things out, lots of phone calls and text messages. Nathaniel's in here. We're very well acquainted. He's in the back over there. This last year, we were actually approached by another company called Halter. They're out of New Zealand, and they focus a lot on intensively grazing and pasture management. One of the biggest things that I've learned through the 2 different companies is, what's your objective? Are you looking for animal containment? Vince is awesome. Are you looking for intensive grazing and pasture management and grass management? Halter's amazing. 2 completely different systems. They do a lot of the same things, but it gets back to what your objectives are.
I don't think I've got anything to add. Said it.
Well, let's hope that the virtual fence technology works better than our microphones. So we'll just bobble with this one and bounce back and forth. So building on that, I guess the next question is, and I'll break these out. Why did you decide to try virtual fence? I mean, what was the trigger that said, yeah, this seems like something I'm going to jump into?
So my main objective when we first started with virtual fence was labor. We actually were having a hard time finding labor and had a guy quit. And just about the time we were getting ready to turn out on an allotment. And then we'd been studying a little bit on it beforehand, and it just kind of was what pushed it over the edge, trying to speed up the process. That is the main reason. And then now that we've used it a little more, it's still a huge labor saving. You will never replace a cowboy, I do not believe, but it does help with labor savings tremendously.
Second part of that one is, so what about virtual fence appealed to you?
I think the original start of it mainly was I was thinking we could do some more intensive grazing on Forest Service allotments. And I think that was after the first 45 days of use when I thought it was going to over and exceed my expectations. We had to back off of that. It works really good for riparian management. Again, if you set your livestock up for success, and the GPS capabilities of it really helps on labor savings, fuel, wear and tear on vehicles, and then like just speeding up the gather. I mean, that part of it is an extreme big part of it.
The reason we got into it was the intensive grazing. Speed up our grazing. We're spending a lot of money on those forest allotments, just putting up fence, just going around that. We're still doing it, but I see the potential to where it'll minimize it. It's not going to get away from it 100%. And then the advantage of having a GPS location on those cattle, it has been quite advantageous. But the real promise lies in being able to much more intensively manage those cattle as far as grazing. I think that's about it.
So what would you say, in your experience, is going well with virtual fence? What do you think are some of the positive things that are working well for you? What have been things that you've learned along the way? And was there anything that you wished you knew before you got into that venture? All right, yeah, there you go.
I don't think that we'd have got into it. Yes, there's been some big surprises, but we would have done it anyway. What was the first part of that question?
What's been going well, and what have you learned?
I'll let Lacey get into what the education part of it. It's all gone well. There has been, like anything you're doing, you'll make 20 steps forward and 5 or 6 back at times. And we experienced some of that this last year. Well, I'll let you.
We've learned a lot. Let's just say that. General answer right there. Setting your cattle up for success, number one. I know that's been harped on quite a bit already. That's number one. Use your landscape for everything it is. Know your land, know your cattle, know what the feasibility of things are. Have fun with it, because it is pretty fun to be a virtual cowboy, if you will. Like Luke said, you're never going to replace a cowboy. You're always going to need to go out there and check your animals, check your fence, see what's going on. One of the really cool things that this last summer has personally taught me is with predator control. We run in common on part of our allotment with another neighbor. They're interested in virtual fencing, however, haven't made that jump yet. They keep telling me, you figure it out. So we go out there and we do that. We had quite a wolf issue this summer, really showed up very heavy where we were. We combined the 2 different herds, ours with collars, theirs without collars, and we could track the patterns and the movement of those wolves by the pattern and movement of the cattle. And it saved us a lot of work. That I could pull it up. I could send that screenshot over to the neighbor. I said, here's the heat map. Here's where they're moving. Here's how much time they've spent. They're still together, it looks like. Maybe 2 or 3 times a week we go up there and check instead of every single day having to send somebody 3 hours up there, 3 hours back. And again, no cell phone service. If something happens, you're kind of in a pickle. So that was pretty cool to learn that we could really track the other behaviors of animals by these collars, because they're animals as well.
And I guess the last part of that question was, is there anything that you wish you would have known before you jumped into this? And that question is really kind of for folks that are here learning from your experience. Is there anything like, oh man, if only I knew?
Prepare and plan. Write your stuff down. Don't go into it with very high expectations. Our experience was quite different than a lot of other people's. We got our towers delivered literally the night before we ship cattle. When we ship our cattle, we have all of our collars pre-programmed anyway, just because we're a couple weeks behind getting towers up into that country. We have a lot going on. The first year was very rough as far as the starting out. But just plan, prepare, slow is fast and fast is slow. That's pretty much what I can share on that one.
All right, I'll try to dive into this a little more. Yeah, these guys, I've been taking everything to start with, so I thought I'd let them take it. I think one thing we did do this year was a little different, and it is an experience on both sides. We did have a fire on one of our allotments. The GPS capabilities helped us speed up the gather. We did get most of them cows put together, and we were pretty much just trying to run from the fire for a little while. The Forest Service had a building that they wanted to protect pretty good up there. So we actually took a set of cows. I think there was 450 cows in that deal. And we locked them into like a 200-acre pasture with some virtual fence. There was no perimeter fences around it. There was perimeter fences around the inside of the Forest Service buildings, but none around the outside. And we held them cattle in there for like 7 days, and was pretty much helping create a fire break. And we could have kept them there longer, but we finally got to where the point we had to leave. The bonus was about that is there was very little slippage. I'm thinking maybe about 8 to 10% slippage made it outside that boundary. And then I created another boundary just a little farther down, and it captured them cattle. So we had the opportunity to get them all gathered when we did have to leave. The one thing that did get me a little bit, is I never left like an opening for an outlet. And when we realized we had to get out that day, I mean, by the time I tried to shut the collars off that morning, and by the time we got there to start gathering, there was like a 6-hour time gap there. And enough of the collars had shut down that I could convince the rest of them cattle to cross the line. But it was a bad deal. I pretty much knocked some training out of them when I done it. My experience from that is if you can find a little spot somewhere, if you do that, to leave an opening that most likely the cattle will not find their way out of. But yet, if something like that happens, you can get out of it. That would be one big piece of learning I did have. Going back to the second part of the question, if I'd have known something before we started this, I think the first year I expected to use it more for intensive grazing purposes, like trying to break up bigger pastures in a Forest Service allotment. And what got me at the end of the season was by trying to do that, we lost the capability of GPS because the batteries went dead in most of the collars. So then it defeated the labor savings on the back end of gathering cattle. That was probably one of my biggest learning experiences. So then the next year, we just backed off of perimeters on the pastures and tried to limit less collar to boundary interactions. And then the collars have, I mean, they made it through the whole season that time.
All right. Just curiosity, you know, elders, you're using two different systems. Vince uses the gateway. And Halter, does it use the same type of gateway, just a different tower system? Okay. So your effectiveness is similar in terms of your terrain and the way they work? All right. Well, I mean, those were the three questions we had, but this is a producer forum. So we're going to rely on the folks online and the folks in the room to come up with some questions more specific to what you'd like to learn from their experiences. This is your opportunity. All right, Luke, oh, you have one more waiting?
So you guys represent pretty early adopters, elders. I know we came and pestered you a while ago, but maybe for the group, because we hear from a lot of producers, we want to see our neighbors do it first, and so we find out what happened. So I was curious if there was some kind of math, whether it's the economics or something else that made you guys take the plunge.
As far as the economics go, I've been trying to keep track of it real close. We're basically a break even right now with what we're paying and what we're saving. We get another year or two, I have full confidence it will really begin to pay for itself. We're still having to put up our interior fences. We've had some battery issues like Luke talked about. So we're putting up our interior fences. We get to where we're not doing that. We're able to much more intensively graze as what we are trying to do. It will no doubt pay for itself very well. Like I said, it's basically a break even right now as near as I can figure it.
All right, there's a question online from Sean Cunningham. And Sean's question is actually to Lacey. Does Halter have a way to deal with emergency moves?
Hi, Sean. We know Sean and Liz pretty well down there. Yes, Halter does have a way for emergency moves. With Halter system, it's all a 100% live feed. It requires 100% coverage of those collars. As of right now, they're working on an update to where it doesn't require that to lessen the amount of towers needed. However, the current system, like I said, does require 100% coverage. Within 3 minutes, every collar is updated and loaded with that message to either shut down a virtual fence or to move the herd to something else. So within 3 minutes, every collar is 100% updated, 100% moving. So it happens pretty quick.
All right, thank you. We have one more question here. And there's clarification, that was 3 minutes with Halter. Let's see, the question here from Sarah Allred is just curious, what type of terrain each is dealing with? If you're dealing with steeper country, how many towers did you end up needing?
Ah, I was actually going to burn a couple minutes with this a few seconds ago just because nobody was asking questions. A little more context to what we're doing. One of our biggest projects is in the Amnaha Canyon, which is one drainage over from Hell's Canyon, which is it the roughest canyon in the United States, maybe? Is that kind of what it is? Our deepest gorge, I think, maybe, is what the statistics are. So we are, I guess, we're looking at it as the way is if we can figure out how to make this work in our context, it'll probably work in a lot of places. But with that being tied together, it took us a lot more towers. The permit that we're running on there in Amnaha is, I think, it's 165,000 acres or something like that, all in, with all of them that we got there. And we put 12 towers on it to cover that. If you just look at a kind of a flat surface map, that seemed extensive. But for what we were trying to do, we were trying to get down into the gorges and the riparians to actually get GPS capability of seeing down into them things to help speed up processes there to keep cattle out of riparians. So it did take a few more towers. We are behind. We did not get 2 of them up. So our coverage is not 100% since last year. But it was pretty shocking how well, with that many towers, and you always, after you get into it, you think, oh, we could put another one here or another one there type of a deal to really catch it. But for what we were doing, it did work pretty good. But I mean, we are in some pretty rough terrain. So
Our terrain isn't quite as extensive as Imnaha or anything. We run a lot in the Malheur National Forest as well as the Wallowa-Whitman Forest. We also have a BLM permit out in Riverside, south of Gentura. We're running at 8 towers total with vents right now and 4 towers with halter. Halter are stationary towers. The vents towers we pick up and move. I know that Extension Agency Research Station, they move their towers as well. They're not necessarily designed to be mobile, but we've adapted them to make them mobile. We have foregone some coverage on our allotments just because the time it takes to move it takes a couple people to move them. They're very cumbersome. They're not that easy to move, but doable. We have really focused on our riparian areas, our boundaries, making sure that they're not slipping into the neighbors, and in those critical habitat areas to really focus on. Anything else we figure, well, okay, 3 days ago she slipped into a drainage, she come out over here, that collar shows up again, and we can track based on that.
So, how often, if you've ever had to replace the towers that you guys are operating with?
Not at all. We've still got the original towers. Oh, our towers have been in operation with vents for 3 years.
Second answer was same. All right, Joe Klein.
Just got a quick question for you, Luke. You were talking about when the fire was approaching, that when you had to leave the area where you had a perimeter established around the buildings. Could you go into a little bit more detail on that? You know, kind of what I was picking up on is that you tried to update the fences, but it didn't make it to all the colors in time. And you were talking about 3 minutes with the other systems. You just talk about that a little bit, give a little bit more detail for people who may not have thought of that aspect.
I'm getting my steps in today. That's good.
So what we had, that is 100% context. We had a fire. We were trying to outrun it. The Forest Service asked us to try to save their Forest Service buildings. So I created a pasture around the Forest Service buildings to try to decrease fuel load to help give them a fire break. I did set up the virtual fence. So the virtual fence was set up on the outside of it, trying to hold the cattle into the perimeter to create a fire break. What did happen is when we finally decided to leave, though, with vents, them collars, I think ours are set up to update every 15 minutes. Some of them you can change, but that's how ours are set up to do. So we had 450 head of cattle in there. So usually when I update something on there, I figure a 24-hour span for it to update to all 400 and some collars in that group. So what happened is that morning when we decided it was time to go, that we could not stay there anymore, I shut all the collars down at, like, I think it was probably about 8:30 that morning.
and we tried to move them cows by noon, and there was probably 75% of them collars that had updated and did shut down, but the 25% that did not, we pretty much caught them in the middle of the herd and made them go, and they did take a stimulant getting across the line. But essentially, that was the point of not having the full 24 hours for the collars to shut down. I'm going to actually hand it to these guys, though, so they can explain these other collars a little better.
So yeah, the halter system is set up and designed to be a live feed, so you can get it on your app in your phone, and you can see exactly every second those cattle are moving. Where Luke said their system with Vince is 15 minutes, ours is set up to update once an hour. So if we're gonna go and move our 1,000 collars, 700 in a herd, depending on where we are, that could take 3 to 4 days for us. So when I pre-program everything, if you're blonde like me and get really excited and passionate about things, you forget to put in your gates to move from pasture to pasture. And it becomes a nightmare very quickly. And your crew doesn't really like you very much at the end of the day. Halter is very easy to change as long as you have that Wi-Fi or internet connection. 3 minutes, it's changed, and you can adapt to anything. That's just one of the difference between the systems. I know that's a lot of information coming at everybody today, but 2 different systems set up to do different things and designed that way.
All right, we have a couple questions online. Let's see, we have one from Condon. What makes halter, quote unquote, better for intensive grazing than vents? And then the second question is, do the collars alert you when an animal is inactive for a certain period of time, or if it's killed by a predator?
So as far as the inactive collar, like a predator kill or anything like that, it doesn't tell us what happened to it. It just tells us that the collar hasn't moved in X number of minutes or days, whatever like that. And it'll send us an alert through their system telling us this is the last known location, this is how many days ago it was, it hasn't moved. As far as, what was the halter question? I'm sorry. Oh, better for intensive grazing. So halter is based out of New Zealand. I don't know if anybody knows, New Zealand has 365 days of grazing. They don't add any forage. They have to graze the forage in the land that they have. This company was designed specifically for intensively grazing on this, to take out the labor, moving to milking sheds, taking out the electric fences. You have the cattle that are trained to come into the milking shed, they graze. It's very intensively set up. The accuracy on halter, because of how it has to be in New Zealand, you're within millimeters of accuracy of the GPS location on those collars. Vents, because it's designed more for containment and for larger US areas, the accuracy that we have seen isn't 100%. This last summer I had some virtual fences. We had a lot of software issues in our collars that didn't get updated in time. So I mean, we run into issues like that all the time. It's still a good product. However, this last season, we could see within a mile of virtual fences being stimulating the cattle in wrong areas where there weren't things, where it shouldn't have been done. The first year, it worked excellent, but going into it, not knowing what we know now, we weren't expecting that accuracy. After working with other companies, we're like, hey, we could get pretty creative here and do a lot of different things. It just gets back to, what are your objectives? Are you trying to intensively graze? Are you trying to manage your cattle? Are you just trying to keep them in your perimeter? Then that tells you what company to kind of start looking at.
Halter has solar panels on their collars, which they stay on for 3 years. That helps.
Lacey talked about that. Anybody in the room?
Have you had, or are you worried about vandalism on the public ground with the towers?
I'm going to say they're worried about it at least. But
As of right now, no, we have not. Yes, it is something we are terribly worried about. I mean, it's kind of a piece of equipment sitting out there, and they're usually in a high spot, and they're shiny where everybody can see them, and it is a worry. As of right now, we have not. I actually even tried to get them insured, and as of right now, like after the fire season last year, there ain't very many insurance companies that want to touch it right now. But it is a worrisome deal.
Same as Luke. The biggest vandalism we have is if we don't set up a physical fence around our towers, the cattle go up and rub on them. And replacing the masts on those isn't cheap or easy. It's a really hard lesson to explain back to the boss what happened.
You have one online?
Yep, here's another online question, and then I'll add another question on top of that that's related. What kind of fire protection do you use around the towers? And have you had any burn? My question is, would those towers attract any type of lightning?
So with the Vince towers, it's all set up in an aluminum case. The mast is up there 40 feet, something like that. Yeah, they're up there quite a ways. And then you got to pick like the highest peak there is, so it'll reach a lot of country. It attracts lightning. There's built-in safeguards and ground wires so that it shouldn't trip out or burn anything in there. I say should. We haven't been in a situation yet that we've been around fires using these, knock on wood, but they're coming. And that'll be kind of interesting to see. Yeah.
So most of our stuff, just because of where we are, most of them deals are like on Scab Rock Flats. So there is not a lot of fuel load around them, but yes, they are a lightning attractant. The one that I did had in Hepner, there was a fire that kind of burnt by it, and I actually had it on a little trailer. But the thing that saved us there is essentially it was out on the open, kind of on a Scab Rock Flat, and the fire that went by it, I mean, it wasn't even hot enough to pop the tires on the trailer. So I think if you were in a heavy fuel load area, I think it would probably melt a lot of wires and stuff. But as of right now, that's kind of what I've seen.
For y'all that are using two different companies, do your cows have two collars or do you have herds that have separate collars? And then if they are doubling up, does that interfere at all with the different systems?
So we don't put two collars on one animal. It's one collar per animal. This last season, we put the halter system on yearling heifers that we were growing and breeding, specifically designed for that intensive grazing. The interaction that we saw between the two systems, the halter is much more animal friendly, if you will, where it's a learned system to where those collars learn that activity and the behavior of each animal to where it may intensively shock a different animal differently than somebody that isn't going to push the boundaries. A halter is more one size fits all. It's going to shock, it's going to sound, it's going to tone the same level for every animal. Vince, sorry. Yes, Vince does that. Halter learns.
I had one too. Can I go? All right, so this is for the note-taking students in the front. How you doing, Jason, by the way? So assuming that some producers or maybe even young folks might want to get in to using this technology, perhaps for like custom grazing or fuels reduction, that kind of thing, what is the first three things they absolutely must do? Right? First three things. And then what's the 1 to 3 things that they absolutely shouldn't do?
I'll just add one. Know what you're doing, know your country. That's map it out, know your water sources, know your country.
I'll add have cows as number one. That always helps. Yeah, you can never have too many cows. Talk to producers that are already using the technology. That's going to be your biggest resource right now. The representatives from the companies are great resources. However, talk to the people actually using it. That is one of the bigger benefits we've seen. And just be patient. It's really hard for some of us, but be patient.
My other one would be make sure you do write down your objectives. That way you do not forget what they are. Patience is a huge part of it. And some of it is you're also the one working with the technology, and make sure that you're willing to learn what the technology can do instead of thinking that it's not doing something on its own, I guess. I mean, maybe that didn't make sense, but make sure you're willing to learn about the technology as you're using it.
I know David had a question. I just want to add, and I'm not on the panel, but have some experience. Like David said, this year we did a pilot project in Wallowa County on the East Moraine Community Forest, which is a county-owned piece of property, about 1,800 acres, and we graze cattle on there. We did a pilot project, and we did learn some stuff. That's where we learned you shouldn't put a collar on a bull because their necks are bigger than their head, and when they about takes an hour, a half a day, and you have to go looking for a collar. So we did that and decided, okay, bulls are not worth collaring. The other thing we did is we tracked the bulls throughout the summer. Bulls weren't an issue. Bulls were not in the riparian area where we were trying to keep them out of. Bulls were not in the Spalding's catch fly. They're with the cows where they should be. And when they weren't with the cows, it's time for them to go home. So non-issue. The other thing that we learned, David said, we set up the vents and we put them in on one side of the moraine, and our idea was to push them into the other pasture on the other side. Problem is the vents that we were trying to push them through with the one-way gate was down a ridge line, and the cows started down there, and with the error in terms of where the satellite thought they were and where the vents line was, cows got up there and some of them were getting shocked, and then they were freaking out and going back, and it became a nightmare. Other thing we learned, make sure that you were going straight in. Don't parallel a fence line, go straight in. Lesson learned. I mean, these are the things that trial and error, that's why we're doing the project. Other thing we learned, these cows that we put put collars on this year had already grazed this moraine for a couple of years. So we had some old girls that knew that that's where they wanted to be, and they didn't care if they had a collar on their neck or not. David called me every morning and say, hey, that number such and such and such and such is right back where she was. And they were just, I think part of it was their learned behavior before they had that training was they were going to override because they knew they'd get to the riparian area. So, I mean, we could deal with those. We could remove them. It wasn't an issue. But again, you're probably going to have a little bit more of a training issue and trying to keep animals contained or out of areas if they have learned behavior already. They're going to fight that, and you'll be fighting that. So, you know, we had some other cows in the group that were fresh to the area, didn't even, I mean, to them, that beep, that shock meant don't go there. The other ones were like, I don't care, there's water down there, I'm going to go. So those were just a few things that we learned that I thought I'd add. And I know we have a few other questions, so go ahead.
What kind of mapping platforms do you use? Do you use GIS or like the Google Planet, or I guess what kind of features are available for that?
So in each application, whether it is a phone-based or web-based, they have their own maps in there that takes off of GPS and it uploads to the satellites, puts it on the ground, and then the collars upload to that. So within each application, they have their own system to use.
A quick question, and it relates to the halter and the fire situation. I'm not familiar with halter. I mean, more familiar with fence. But it was interesting you said, okay, 3 minutes, real time. Does it not have the capability, though, then, if they're out of the tower range? They're not going to be able to update, though, right? I mean, so in other words, you're going to need to be close. I'm just asking because of on how that's working. Like with the vents, if they're in a bad spot, you're not going to update it at all. I mean, the way it is the halter the same way, or is it different from that perspective?
With Halter, there's still a lot of unknowns because New Zealand, it's all 100% live, up to date, very meticulous on their measurements. One of the learning curves that we had with Halter coming into the Northern Hemisphere this year was the location of things and when to turn our virtual fences on and off. Turned out it was just a back office, forgot to push a button on it. Everything was updated within 2 days, went put the yearlings back, everything worked great. We don't know the range of the towers for Halter yet. It's something that we're experimenting with and learning. It's going to be really fun to see this summer when we put them on the forest allotments and the timber. New Zealand doesn't have timber. They're not allowed to graze their waterways or in their timber, so we're experimenting and learning all that out. So I'll get back to you on that.
The one thing though that may help those callers can communicate with each other. So all those callers don't necessarily need to be in contact with the tower, the callers. Yes, yes.
All right, here's another question from Sean Cunningham online. Do the external boundaries have to be inside of the tower, or do the collars keep a record of the fence even when the cow is out of service? I guess we just answered that, right? Second one is, how reliable are the collars? How well do the collars stay on? What percentage are rubbed off? And that's from Bernie Weldon.
I get started. So we have only used vents, and we've got two different iterations of the collar so far. The first collar set we got, there was probably about a 25% loss on retention. The second set seemed a lot better last year, and all they done was change a little design. But with that being said, moving forward in 26, they're supposed to have a whole new iteration, which probably will be a heck of a lot better on collar retention and battery life. So I'm really excited to see them as they move forward.
With the fence collars, I'm running 4 to 4.5% rubbed off in the heavy timber. We're seeing more malfunctions with the front plate popping off. Whether that's from the manufacturer, wear and tear on it, we're not quite sure. We're working with Vince on that. Halter, we had, I think, 3 rub off, and those were really itty bitty 3-weight calves that the collar's not designed for. And we knew that going into it, that they'll rub them off, they'll fall off, go out, pick it up. We're fine with that. But very few are really coming off, and we're in some really thick, heavy timber that they'll rub them. We've been collaring all of our bulls, all of our cows. This last year, I had, out of 40-something bulls, I had 2 collars left on the bulls by the time we gathered. Previous years, I had 100% of the collars on. So I think it just depends on the year, who's putting collars on, all sorts of different factors.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know why I haven't thought of this before, but all but one of our towers between OSU and ARS is mobile. And we haul around cattle panels, put cattle panels up around the trailers to keep the cows off of them. My question is, why couldn't you create a virtual fence around that tower and skip the cattle panels? I'm trying to figure out if I'm missing something there.
Well, I only went to college for a couple years, so I don't have a degree, so that's probably why. Honestly, I just didn't think about it. It's one of those things that you talk to other minds and other ideas, and you get other ideas.
One thing that I think it's not a crucial thing, and I can't speak for Halter, but we're limited on how many fences we can do. And so when I look at the trailer, it's pretty easy to put 4 panels around a trailer rather than lose 4 of my sides, or maybe even more than that if I need more than one to keep them off. Plus, that doesn't do anything about elk. That doesn't do anything about other stuff. But.
Has severe weather ever interfered with the towers or the what are they called? Oh, the collars, sorry. Has severe weather ever interfered with like the collars updating the location of your livestock or anything else?
Not that I know of. Yeah, they design the towers to withstand pretty good. As long as you get the tower set down pretty good, so they don't tip over or anything, I'm gonna say that they'll probably, I mean, as far as I can tell, I've never seen anything as long as the tower's still in its right position.
Same with us. We haven't had any issues with weather interfering with anything.
All right, we have a few other questions online. So this is from Connor. Did you utilize any cost-sharing programs to get started with virtual fencing? And then the second one, from Sean Cunningham, did you have to adjust the collars on the yearlings last summer as they grew?
When we first started with Vince and even with Halter, everything has been out of pocket. We haven't utilized any of the cost sharing programs. A lot of those are brand new within the last year or two. There are some grants that are finally coming out and available. However, they're pretty tough to get approved for right now. Very few availabilities to them, but they're starting to become more popular. And then the other part of that, yes, Sean, we were supposed to adjust the collars. We did not, but we were supposed to, just because those animals grow. There's no expansion part of any of these collars yet between the two companies. None of the animals were affected by it by the stage we took them off, but we were getting to the point where we were going to have to run them back through the chute, adjust them, and then turn them back out.
I have not put it on any yearlings, so I won't answer that question. But as far as cost sharing, the first ranch we done it all out of pocket. And then the second one we did have some help, and Dan actually will speak to that in the second panel. So save that for him. I actually got one other question real quick. I got a question I want to ask these guys. Yes.
Sorry, Luke. On the topic of cost share, yes. So this after our break, coming soon, we will hear from some folks at a Soil and Water Conservation District who's been figuring that out. And we also have 2 representatives from the Natural Resource Conservation Service to talk about that now and into the future.
Okay, so a minute ago, you guys on these other callers, you mentioned that they had a solar panel on them. My question is, are you worried when you go into the timber that it will affect the solar panel on them?
Not at all.
Dad says no, I say slightly. There's still a battery within. We're family, what do you say? There's a battery on each side of the collar. I wish I had one to show everyone, but there's solar panels on each side as well. These are, I don't know if they're guaranteed, but they're told to last 3 to 5 years on each animal. This is a mature animal. Yearlings, you'll have to adjust them, lengthen them out, shorten them, whatever you need to do. Hopefully not shorten them, but lengthen them out. Yeah, but we're not worried about the timber.
What are you going to say, Michael?
Nice to see you, Rob and Lacey. It's been a while. I had the pleasure to talk with Rob and Lacey amongst a lot of other virtual fence users using a lot of different projects or products all over the country this last year. With the solar panels, what I heard people down in New Mexico using it, like all over, is that really comes down to how well you're setting them up for success. If they're bumping into boundaries, then they're going to have their batteries drain more frequently, and then the solar has to work better. If they're never bumping into boundaries, then you never need the solar to charge it up. That's my only input for that.
Was there a question in there somewhere?
All right, here's another question coming out of Wasco County. What information is provided by Vents or any other brands and that has been really helpful in making grazing management decisions?
The best resource that we've had are the representatives for each company. Nathaniel's sitting in the back. I'm sure he wouldn't mind passing out his contact information. Halter, you can look them up online, halterhq.com, and their people will get back to you as well. But when we were first starting out, those were the resources that we had. And then, like I said earlier, contacting other producers that are using these other resources just to help to bounce ideas. This is what we're seeing real time. This is what we're struggling with. What are you guys doing with it? But to start with, contact the representatives for the company.
Be ready for a steep learning curve.
I guess I'll kind of add into it. Like once you get into the system and start using it, there is like a lot of heat sourcing and like GPS data that you can collect from each pasture, like where the cows have actually spent a lot of time and stuff that can help you adjust like grazing plans and things like that. So once you kind of get into the system, I think there is a lot of different options you can use once you get inside of it.
If I wanted to send somebody mapping information regarding boundaries or temporary fences? Is it just, do these programs take shape files, or is there anything specific that, what's the best way for me to relay that type of information to someone who would be grazing?
I'm a slow learner and I take the hard way. So in all of these programs, I go and physically draw out my maps and my different paddocks, my different pastures, all the different moves I want. I believe there's a way to upload like Google Earth maps and stuff into it. I just have no idea how to do that.
Yeah, so what we done is we had a lot of ours mapped out like on Google Earth or something prior to that, and you can actually just pull a KML file off and send it right to them, and then they can show you how many towers you need. And then if you actually have your pastures mapped out, they'll upload it into the platform as well.
I think we have 10 more minutes, don't we?
I'm a little bit embarrassed. I don't know this, and I do a little bit with Vince, but Halter is more cellular based. Is that fair to say, number one? And number two, are they specific to a cell provider?
Dan, I would say the cellular requirements between the two companies would be the same. It's just dependent on how live you want the feed to be. And that's one thing that we're working with Halter on to see exactly what is the coverage of the towers, how many towers do we need to get the response we're wanting, what our objectives are. Yeah, it just depends on what you want to see from the product, and Halter is very new in the US still, so we're figuring it out. It doesn't matter. Our vents towers, we run on several different pieces, and depending on how the wind is blowing, you get better coverage from a different company than others. So we've had to switch our modems from AT&T to Verizon on one allotment, the other allotment's on AT&T, and then the BLN doesn't matter. So we have to keep towers specific to locations for the service that we have. Oh yeah, the halter collars, not every collar needs to be in contact with the tower because the collars themselves speak to each other. So if you have one or two collars in contact with the tower with halter, those one or two collars will relay the message to the other collars out of that range. Where vents, you have to have every one of them. Yes, and the towers talk to each other. Where vents is very singular, there's no intercommunication. Just one of the differences.
Do you remove the collars after the end of each grazing season and then put them back on? What's the time frame per collar?
So Vince, we have to take the collars off at the end of each season. Our batteries, we're seeing anything from 4 to 6 month usage. That's specific to us. I'm pretty intensive on breaking our pastures up. They're running into the boundaries a lot. I want to see where they are. I'm using the moving Vinces as much as possible just because of that labor standpoint. Halter, those collars are going to stay on that animal for 3 to 5 years, assuming that they're a mature animal. And there's no malfunctions, there's no breaking, anything like that. The time it takes to put on per animal, it depends on the animal. We run a lot of horned cattle. Those get tricky to catch in a chute. I'll just put that out. And then our cows aren't used to going into a chute. They don't see it but once or twice in their entire life. We're a very different operation. We like crazy ideas and do things way different. We'll get into that some other time. So we run a lot of range cows. I'm sure you guys know the difference between a range cow and a pasture cow. I'll leave that to interpretation as well. It depends on the person you have, the supplies you have, how you're set up, and the animals you have in front of you.
We're probably less than a minute on each cow. It does vary a little bit, 30 to 45 seconds per cow.
we're the same type of deal. We run it on only on mother cows, of course. But we do run our cows through the chute more. They are outside range cows, but we run them through the chute more. So I'll put ours on in late March, 1st April sometime, maybe even later than that a little bit. And then we pull them off when we preg. So that's usually late November, December sometime. Battery life's about the same thing. 4 to 6 months, it kind of seemed like. And yeah, if you kind of get a system down, you can smoke right through them. Like we were vaccinating our cows last spring and collaring them. I mean, the whole shebang in like 32 seconds ahead type of a deal. So once you kind of figure it out, it doesn't slow you down. But the first few, you're a little awkward.
So this is a question for Lacey. You've mentioned that it's unknown what the range of the halter towers is. And in that case, I'm thinking of Luke's application of 165,000 acres in pretty rugged country. Would you therefore say that halter's ready to serve Luke's needs in that environment?
Yeah, depending on what Luke's objectives are. If he wanted to intensively graze, go into an experiment with halter, great. If not, keep with vents. It depends on what your objectives are. We know vents, their range can be up to a couple miles per tower. It just depending on what your objectives and what you want to do with your operation are.
Nathaniel, we had some of the halter collars showing up 8 miles away. Some of those that we had to pick up. Now that was over just flat, straight line completely, but we're still experimenting to see how far it'll be.
Okay, so we're winding down on our panel here, and I did want to give our panelists the opportunity if you had anything else you wanted to share, or we can take probably one more question.
All right, so we do have a question related to, let's see, is there any research use of virtual fencing to graze as part of a crop rotation? Would one need 100% efficiency or efficacy to keep livestock out of adjacent croplands?
I'm not aware, I'm sure these guys can speak to some. I'm not aware of any research done in that regard. And my opinion is, yes, you would need 100% efficacy to keep cattle out of a joining. You would need it.
Last call. We can go to.
Yeah, just one comment on if you're just getting started in virtual fencing and you see collars on Craigslist or something, I wouldn't buy those collars. And the reason I wouldn't buy them, they may be perfect working order, but one of the things that came up earlier is when you're just getting started, your relationship with a company that's going to service your needs and help you to get started is going to be really crucial in this, as well as talking to people who are already doing it. But I know for us, the company we happen to work with, Vince, was crucial in our ability to get off the ground running and keep us from making a lot of other mistakes that we probably would have made.
Well, thanks everyone. Thank you to our panelists, Robin Lacey with Elder Ranches and Luke Morgan with Probert Ranches. Thank you to our moderators, Dustin Johnson, Pete Schrader. We now have a break, and on your agenda, we left just 10 minutes from it, but we are an adaptive group, and so I'm going to propose adding an extra 5 minutes. I'm reading the room. It's really full. Get some snacks, maybe step outside and get some fresh air, but one thing that you might use the break for, and actually I'm going to step to the front, is to meet and chat with the experts you just met up here, but I'm also going to introduce a couple more folks who you'll hear from this afternoon. And so go find them, hear from them. So you met Chad Boyd there in the back. Please wave again. David Bonert, again, one of our experts, the three folks up here. We will, I would like to introduce Nathaniel Slinkert with events. If you could stand up, Nathaniel, so he could speak specifically to that product, direct you to where you could get some information on that. We are also joined today by John O'Keefe with O'Keefe Ranch. John, if you could give a wave. There he is. You will hear from him after the break here. Lindsay Smith with Lakeview BLM in the room here. Thanks, Lindsay. And then Heather Murphy in the back with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, and then also Joe Klein there in the back. Online, we have some folks from the Gillum Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as Sean Mork and Brian Anderson from Walla-Whitman National Forest. If you have questions for those folks, and Dan Probert right there, and you'll hear from Dan after the break. If you are someone online and you have questions for the experts that you met this morning or the ones I just read off, go ahead and message Sergio, your online moderator, and he'll make sure and transmit that to the room. The one other thing we're going to do during the break is just put up the Rangelands Gateway information page on Virtual Fence. If you're someone who would like to scroll through it and see what's offered there, David can help show you around there. So let's reconvene at 2:25. So getting an extra 5 minutes, and we'll hit the ground running after that. Thanks, everyone.
See, it's working now. Gene Maxwell. See?
Hello, this is Johanna.
There's the awkward camera that'll show everyone the top of your head. Well, I mean, I'll rotate among you all. You kind of need one of these. Thank you, sir. Are we unmuted? Thanks, everyone, for sitting down so quickly. Looks like maybe we freed up some chairs. If you were someone standing in the back or further away than you'd like, feel free to move a little closer. So the rest of this workshop today, we wanted to do, something pretty similar to before the break, where we're hearing directly from producers, from agencies, from organizations using virtual fence on mixed ownership landscapes, acknowledging that that's the reality for a lot of livestock producers in Eastern Oregon. And so we've gotten a panel where we have a combination of private landowners and also the agencies or organizational counterparts who've been engaging in some planning together. And so I'm really, really pleased to introduce here in the room a couple folks. So we have Dan Probert with Probert Ranches in northeastern Oregon. We have online, kind of paired with Dan, Sean Mork and Brian Anderson, and they're with the Wallowa Whitman National Forest. And so, Sean and Brian, I will be asking you to unmute periodically when we send questions your way and sharing from your office your perspectives. We're also joined online by Herb Winters, the district manager of Gillum Soil and Water Conservation District, and also Roger Lathrop, the project manager in the same office. And we heard they have a room full of folks there in Condon, and so we're really pleased to have them with us too. And so we will periodically be seeing their faces on the screen above us. We also are joined by John O'Keefe, there on the end with O'Keefe Ranch, out of Adel, Oregon, and then Lindsay Smith with Lakeview Bureau of Land Management. And so they had a little bit of a drive this morning, and so we're really glad for them to be here. So again, we're just interested in, some producers are starting to go, okay, so it sounds like it works on private land. Well, I don't want to only use collars. Is it really worth it if it's just private land? And so how do I do it across these extensive landscapes? Or in the case of Gillum SWCD, and we'll be hearing from them in a moment, they have a lot of landowners who have all been impacted. And so how can that collective benefit from a virtual fence system? So I'm just going to start with Dan because you're here on the end here with me. And this is also for Sean and Brian online. And so how have you been working using virtual fence with the U.S. Forest Service, Dan? What have you been seeking to do together?
Yeah, so the seed money, I would tell you we got on our allotment, we had the good fortune of getting burned out, right? So there were fire funds available. So we were able to tap into some fire rehab money that Brian and Sean can talk about. more effectively. But as Luke mentioned, we're in some of the steepest country in North America, but we're also in, I guess, some of the most environmentally sensitive as well. And so we were able to also tap into Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, helped us with funding, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I guess maybe I should back up. In this fire, which was called the Double Creek Fire, and I think it ended up being about 100 and some thousand acres, we lost all our fences. And if you think about elk movement, you think about, we have bighorn sheep, mule deer. Nobody was really interested in putting those fences back up, including us. And in our case, which is maybe even more unique, we're in a national recreation area. We can't drive to any of it. So we were talking about actually packing or helicoptering in material for 15 plus miles of fence. So we were incentivized to find money, and we did. And so Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, we weren't in time, but I think we eventually might get some help from, I don't know what the organization is called that represents bighorn sheep. But with all this technology, and I may be wrong, but at least with vents, you have an ongoing cost, right? You have a rental value with those collars. And so I think as we continue this, and I think as organizations embrace the technology, I think those opportunities are just going to get larger to help with funding. But those are the main ones that we worked with.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. To Brian and Sean online. So Dan mentioned a couple funding sources. And so just to clarify, Dan, you made the decision following the 2024 fire season?
No, it would have been, Double Creek was 23, maybe. This summer was the first year that we used the technology on what we call the Saddle Creek allotment.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So Sean and Brian, it sounded like there was some funding. I'm also curious, what was your role in helping Dan's operation get this on the ground on his Forest Service allotments?
Yeah, hi. Hey, can you guys hear us okay? We coming across?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, hey, thanks for having us. I'm Brian Anderson. I'm the district ranger, and this is Sean Mork. He's the range management specialist. And I'll start and I'll turn it over to Sean. But yeah, Dan's right. Yeah, I think it was actually 2022 Double Creek fire. So we've experienced a ton of large fires across Eastern Oregon, especially last year. But when we had the Double Creek fire, it burned up quite a few range allotments across Hells Canyon National Recreation Area, and a lot of fences were impacted. And the Forest Service has had a couple of different post-fire recovery programs. We're all, I think, used to sort of the BEAR program, which is where they kind of address mud and flood concerns, but there's also a program called Burned Area Rehabilitation. And that was a program to address losses to infrastructure. So, you think about signs or picnic tables at campgrounds, but it also included fences for range allotments. And so as we looked at the post-fire rehabilitation needs and what we were going to request funding for, range fences was one of those components. And I'll let Sean talk about sort of how that conversation evolved into virtual fence. But having Dan and Luke and their willingness to explore some different options as opposed to putting up traditional barbed wire fence was something we were interested in for exactly what Dan mentioned, just different innovative ways to protect the resources, but also be able to manage the cattle. So Sean, do you want to talk about kind of how it worked to secure those bar funds and put them towards this particular infrastructure?
Yes. So good afternoon. We
in pretty rapid succession after your fire occurs, and even while it's occurring, people start to ask you what is affected, and they want lists and funding requests and such. And so we asked for funding to reconstruct wire fence, and prior to that going up, Dan asked us, can we look at this virtual fence project? And so he brought it to us and said, here's our proposal. And we took it to our people and said, this is how much fence, this is what it can pay for, and this is what we can replace and manage for all these things. And they said yes. So the Forest Service willing to replace the idea versus exactly what was affected. And in the case of Saddle Creek, we probably will have better management than we did with the wire fences just because of inaccessibility. The way you get in there is you hike or you pack. There's a pretty significant elevation change, so it's affected. The adjacent places that we also enable management have a lot of ESA fish, a couple plants, and so we get to improve the management on those places also. So there was a pretty broad idea over a pretty large landscape.
Thanks, you two. Follow-up question real quick. I know we have a couple producers in the room right now. How many of you are thinking about virtual fence because you were affected by wildfire this summer? And feel free to drop it in the chat as well. Right. In general, we've been getting a lot of questions as well. So Sean and or Brian, do you have any advice to folks who maybe aren't in Wallowa Whitman National Forest, but they run cows on Forest Service allotments? Is there something or someone they should be asking in their different areas, just generally speaking, the types of questions they might want to consider?
And I'll let Sean help me here, but I think with all range improvements, there's a cooperative relationship, right, between the permit holder and the agency in terms of how much funding is allocated. So I think we were real successful because Dan was willing to explore this and really, frankly, able to go out a little further on a limb than for the risk was bigger for him than for us, I would say. But so nonetheless, working with your local range manager, your local federal office that's administering that permit early to kind of share what you're thinking, I think would be helpful. I don't know. Is that what you think, Sean?
Yes. And there's a number of these projects now in Oregon and Washington. So I think there's a good template for like the paperwork at the Forest Service. Mm-hmm. The thing that happened last summer is a couple years ago, there was only Vents, and now Vents has competitors. So I think we have to put some thought into what do we want to have as a long-term in this area, or what is already existing on that forest or that area, because I think at the moment the systems don't work together. So like thinking about cost efficiency or neighbors using the same products, or if it's all rancher procured equipment, that might be one thing. But as the Forest Service starts to purchase some of the equipment, can we move it to other allotments? And how do we get people to work together?
Yeah, that makes sense. So in general, it sounds like asking your local people and just finding out what those options might be. So that was a great segue. Thank you, you two, to Gillum SWCD. I will get to O'Keefe Ranches in a bit, but the Gillum County Soil and Water Conservation District had a lively fire season, and as a result has really pursued virtual fencing. And so Herb and Roger, tell us a bit about what you've been doing and what direction you've chosen to take within Gillum County.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. My name is Herb Winters. I'm the district manager, the Gillum Soil and Water Conservation District. I have Roger Lathrop, the project manager for our district as well here. I'll let Roger speak a little bit about how maybe some steps we took up front to expose producers in our area to virtual fencing, and then kind of what led us to where we are now, starting up a virtual fencing program. Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, so a little background, every year prior to planning our annual meeting, we kind of reach out to our local producers when looking into getting a speaker, any issues or concerns they have or anything they want to learn more about. And two years ago, two of the topics, hot topics were fire mitigation and virtual fence. I in turn reached out to Dustin and Katie and had them come out and speak on fire mitigation and virtual fence. We had a lot of interest in virtual fence and using it as a tool. However, nobody seemed to want to jump into adopting that technology. Last year, we reached out to our producers again. And again, virtual fence was a super hot topic. So we had Nathaniel come out from Vents and speak. Again, we had a ton of interest, but nobody else was using the technology in Gillum County, so nobody was ready to just jump in and try it. This year we had the Lone Rock fire. Throughout the fire, Herb and I were going out and checking with producers to see what they needed, what we could do to help. I immediately started mapping fences within the burn boundary. Quickly learned that hundreds of miles of fence were in that burn boundary. And while there was smoke still in the air, one of the producers that attended both those annual meetings reached out to me and said, I think now is the time to look into virtual fence. And so Herb and I went together, and that's where we started pursuing funding to try to get this in place.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, and so at that point, we had to just come up, like, how much money are we going to need to meet our objectives? And so we worked with Nathaniel, got an estimate on how many towers we might need. Something that us in the government deal with is funding. A lot of times goes on funders' cycles. So there is an urgent need to get this technology out on the ground. And our traditional funding sources, the timelines just weren't gonna work out for us. So we had to think outside the box a little bit and went to the Ford Family Foundation asking for funding, and ultimately went to our county government asking for them to help us out in this situation. And through that and investments by our producers and by our conservation district, like within under 40 days, we were able to come up with over $200,000 to get the equipment we needed out on the ground to help folks that had all their fence burned up and needed to find additional pasture. And so with that, with those investments from the county court and the Ford Family Foundation and our producers, we have our conservation district now owns 10 mobile towers. We have the funding for callers for the producers that are interested in the technology, and we were able to get towers out this winter when folks needed it. And moving forward, we're putting in future grants with the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and our grant that we just submitted was ranked number 2, so we are expecting to get that funding. And the idea is to use the funding to kind of build up a virtual fence program in Gillum County, starting in the Lone Rock area with these folks affected by the fires. And with that is bringing in a bunch of partners. This is all new to us as well. And so, getting NRCS, Katie and her team to help with us. The idea is to bring on as many early adopters as we can, build a network, get additional resources out here in Gillum County to help with grazing management plans, and people with expertise on how to use this technology. Not only around fire, but just management and some of the other topics that have been brought up today. So we're just getting started, but I think we've got a really great foundation, a lot of good people helping us, and we're able to find the funding so far, and hopefully we continue to be successful and build a good program out here. Anyone say anything, Robbie? I think that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you both. We'll circle back around to maybe hear about some of the specifics of what some of the producers in your area are doing with that virtual fence. So I want to acknowledge, all SWCDs are different. All counties might have different priorities. And so this is just one example. And so, I'd asked Roger and Herb to share with us today about how they've been doing it in the hope that, some of you can go to your, county commissioners or SWCDs and explore these options where you live. So here at the end, we have, again, John O'Keefe and Lindsay Smith. And John is a relatively new adopter of virtual fence, but we asked this team to be on our panel today because this is a great example of a producer working to use virtual fence on his BLM allotments. And so tell me a bit about, what your goals were and why you wanted to pursue this route. I'll start with John.
Thank you, Katie. That's right. I'm a little newer at this than some of the other guys. I totally enjoyed the earlier panel and learned a lot. I guess to put in a little perspective, in 23, I got an opportunity to serve on the USDA Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission, and we sent a report to Congress. And I was one of the few people on that commission with rangeland experience, but one of the recommendations that we sent in to Congress was to take advantage of Barry Perryman and Kirk Davies' good work and start getting fall grazing of these invasive annual grasses done out on the ground. Because, west-wide, that may be the #1 issue we have to fix to keep our ranges intact. And once I was party to getting that to Congress, I felt then it was time to help get it on the ground. Been lots of pilots, lots of plots. We know it's successful, so we got to get it to the landscape. And in that environment, the BLM with the infrastructure money and the Inflation Reduction Act money, there was opportunities to do things. And so we took a chance. We decided to try and make this a learning experience, and that was what it was, absolutely. Didn't go big. We wanted to learn. We took 2 loads. That was easy to do. We had our loads on pasture. We preg tested them, put the collars on, brought them in, trained them, went out, and we started to work. So I guess that's a good summary of what we were about. I guess for an objective like something like utilization above 50% on the majority of the pastures on the cheatgrass and to largely reduce the thatch.
Yeah, I think John did a great summary of the project that we were doing. And it's a little bit opposite from where, they're coming from. Hey, we see this need. The way that BLM came into it is hey, we have this money now, and we know that we can put it towards the virtual fence project. Now let's see which of our permittees are interested. And John stepped up right away last year and was like, I have a project in mind. Here's where we're gonna do it. Do we agree? And we said, of course we agree. Like this is a great project, and we're going to continue it into this next fall. And this last fall was a learning opportunity, and we can take everything that we learned from our opportunity, from everyone else's opportunity, and probably have a much better project this next year.
Well, that was a great segue, Lindsay, into the next question. So, what I'm hearing is it's helpful for your office, at least, maybe other BLM districts, for a producer to maybe have an idea to bring to you, and then the two of you can figure it out. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, in our case, we already have this money coming down to us. It wasn't like a permittee needed to ask for these funds. And so in our situation, yes, we need willing permittees for projects. We're working with John O'Keefe this fall. We're going to work with other permittees this spring and summer. And for the most part, yeah, our permittees are coming up with the projects themselves, and then BLM is on board with what they're saying and making sure that we're both on the same page and both getting the results that we want.
Yeah, thanks. And so your role, John, you had an idea you wanted to reduce cheatgrass, you wanted to reach a certain utilization. In terms of figuring that out across your ranch, how did that process work for you?
Well, like I said, it was a learning experience. It was right in the middle of the mash in the fall. We were weaning, doing lots of things. So we probably was a little too careful, put 80 cows on 500 acres so we wouldn't have to come back in a week and find them. And actually, we were just starting to get good utilization in about a month. And we learned a lot as we did that. We had just a momentary loss of power to our perimeter fence one day when I kind of mismanaged the chart and got it right back on. It was down for 2 hours, but we did have about 20 cattle get out, and the fall green up was all eaten on the inside, and the fall green up was still readily available on the outside. And those cattle had to come back for water every 1 or 2 days, but once they learned where the green up was, we didn't get them retrained. So it's pretty important not to make boo-boos like that. I think if I did it, or we will do it again, we're going to do it in the fall. I think we'll start at about 80 cows on about 150 acres, and we'll get right into the landscape treatment. 10, 12 days we'll be looking at a landscape treatment. It'll probably take some supplementation to get the landscape treatment we want and still treat our cows okay. And then one of the things, it got a little too late in the year when we didn't make our pastures smaller, and we were starting to get into storm, and these cows are only 5 miles away from the area they lived all their life and got fed hay all winter. So I was a real wondering how well it had worked to get to the high utilization and start the hay and still keep them inside the virtual fence when they knew the haystack was only 5 miles away. When we finally decided to, right before Christmas, we'd given the employees Christmas off, and it was a stormy time, and we didn't figure we could learn too much about supplementation behavior when we were trying to separate out the storm behavior, so we decided to come home. So we were home in 3 hours, but we did learn a lot. The cows were trainable. I think one thing I might do a little different would be the training went just textbook, 4 days and they were trained, but I might wait another 2 days and watch for the escapees and maybe eliminate them and replace them with cows that were more trainable. I think when your objective's a landscape treatment rather than a herd management treatment, that's another option you can look at when you've got other cattle available. I could go on, but I think that gives you a flavor of what went on.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm troubled. I just found out John keeps a hit list then of escapees. I'm joking. So Dan, you're going to get this question in a moment, but in the spirit of, talking about partnerships with the BLM, so this made sense because you're looking at the landscape rather than, just your individual pasture. And so how did you make this work? Did it just follow your existing terms and conditions? Was there something else that the BLM needed to layer on top of this administratively?
Yeah, so the only thing that we had to do was we had to shift the grazing dates slightly for John's allotment. So we had to do a determination of NEPA adequacy, but that was it from my knowledge on the range side that we had to do to allow him to do this project.
And just to clarify, that was because it wasn't a massive departure from what you would normally be doing. Okay, John says yeah. So Dan, this is a Forest Service allotment that you've been working with these folks on. So were you changing your practices much on that allotment, or was it pretty much the same?
Yeah, so we didn't. We didn't change our practices a lot, and glad Brian reminded me. The fire was in 22, took a non-use in 23, and then implemented the grazing this summer. I think the bigger piece though, that for me at least, is building partnerships, relationships is really part of our DNA as a company. And so I was remiss in mentioning Vents. Vents contributed to our project as well. They paid for 2 of the towers, which I think when we get them all put in, there'll be 12 on these allotments. But we also were in communication with the Nez Perce tribe, who has a stake in our allotments. We kind of build out from there. We used local FFA kids. So elders, I think, would agree, these towers are a pain in the butt to put together. And so we engaged the FFA kids to help construct the towers. Then you have to replace 750, in our case, 750 batteries every year. FFA kids did that. There's ways to engage beyond just the agency, which is great. I mean, Brian and Sean are great, but there's other places that in our case, we want to build relationships in our community.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. I did want to hear from Sean and Brian about the administrative conditions question real quick. Then I have a question from Gillum. Sean and Brian, anything to add? Just thinking that there might be other Forest Service folks online or here at this workshop, anything that your office needed to figure out to make this work with Dan?
Do you want to speak to that, Sean? I mean, in terms of the permit or AOI, there wasn't a lot of changes that I recall.
Right. We didn't change our season of use here, and we are largely limited by terrain and weather. This isn't a place for winter grazing. Most of that area is all covered in snow now. So we were using virtual fence to replace wire fence, and to better manage the cows. The question for us has been posed a lot of times about invasive annual grasses. I'm not sure how to make that work here yet. So a lot of our grazing is moved around based on not grazing at the same time at the same place year after year, or among when fish are present or absent in the creeks and rivers by us, or some endangered plants. So trying to manage grazing and manage for those other things. So no, we haven't made changes to how we graze or had to do any additional NEPA or environmental analysis or anything to change from wire fence to virtual fence.
And if I could, I'll just sort of tack on to what Dan shared about relationships. Like Sean mentioned, we have 3 listed fish species and 2 listed plant species that we manage for in Hell's Canyon that drive a lot of our grazing strategies. And I appreciated Dan offering to host a meeting, a call with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries to just roll out this technology and his plan, and sort of what he was thinking about doing, and sharing it directly with those consulting agencies that we work with, because they were very interested, right? We have goals of trying to limit impacts to streams and or to these rare plants, and it was just a really good opportunity for the consulting agencies, which we work directly with, sometimes behind the scenes from our permit holders, but to engage directly with them and let them ask some questions. And they were very interested, right? About how this could look in a few years as more and more livestock producers or permittees pick it up and start to move with it. So just really appreciated that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That was a good segue to the next question. But just to summarize, and I just want to run this past our panelists, it sounds like one thing that's helpful are producers approaching different agencies or organizations in their communities with curiosity, right? I have this idea. Is this possible? Will this work? And going from there. I'm seeing some nods up here. Yeah. Herb and Roger, we've heard a lot about community and partnerships, and I know that your community there in Gillum County also had a role in this virtual fence program you guys have been getting up and running. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Do you want to talk about the FFA kids real quick?
Yeah, I can just start. I ran into a similarity. We were assembling the first two towers in the parking lot when it was 30 degrees and the wind was blowing and the fog was coming in and out. And we came up with an idea to engage the local ag program and FFA students as well. And took those parts and pieces into a heated shop and let the students assemble those, as well as doing a presentation on virtual fence, and kind of educating them a little bit about the technology. Some of those students were here this morning for part of the presentation, but they are going to continue to be involved in our virtual fence program.
Yeah, and I mentioned the county. The county recognized the need following the Lone Rock fire, and we went to the county court requesting the funds, explained the situation, and our county court was gracious enough to give us that funding when we couldn't find it elsewhere. And that really, like I said, gave us the foundation to get this program started, get the equipment we needed. And now, we moving forward is to set up similar meetings like this one, but more locally, out in Lone Rock where the fire occurred, and get, the community of Lone Rock and the producers out there, all in the same room, have similar conversations to this, and learn from one another. And folks that are using the technology, get them to tell other and how it's working for them so far.
Kind of cut out there at the end. Was there anything you wanted to add?
I'm not sure where I cut out, but basically we're hoping to get this program up and running, and that is going to take the whole community, learning from one another, asking the folks that have tried the technology so far, what same conversations we're having today, what worked, what didn't, putting more heads together, and you look at what can be done with this technology, and the list is long as my arm, and trying those different strategies over time. We're all very excited about the technology and where we're headed.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just to wrap us up with a lightning round, and I'm going to stay with Gillum County because you kind of were starting to go down this road. Is there anything you're looking forward to or curious about or looking forward to learning about in the next year?
Yeah, I think, and I'll jump in if you'd like, Roger, but I think we're excited to, we're partnering with Sustainable Northwest. They've just threw a fluid position for regenerative ag program, and that position is going to be helping us out here in Gillum County partially. So getting someone else out here to kind of be a liaison between the producers, OSU Extension, the Ag Research Center, and ourselves and RCS. I'm excited about building these partnerships and learning together and seeing, how this technology will work, on the production side, the natural resource protection side, everything in between. This is going to be a lot of learning for us this next year. It's a little intimidating, but it's exciting at the same time. So we're excited about all those, everything we can learn over the next year, I guess.
It's like you got a supportive comment online. Yeah, same question to you, John. Is there anything you're looking to in the next year?
Yeah, first thing I'm really looking on tightening up the prescription and really getting into landscape treatments out on the cheatgrass. But the other thing I'm looking at, and Chad said it a little bit, you're looking at outcomes. You're not looking at tools. But we're in a little bit different place here. If we're going to take full benefit of virtual fence, we kind of got to nerd out and and ride this tool as hard as we can until we discover the potential. And what I found in my real short journey with this is this technology is changing so fast that that it's almost like you're got your Sony Beta now and you're going to be somewhere else next year. And I think in 10 years it'll be so different that and it'll be user friendly and effective. So I think getting from here to there is going to involve a lot of short steps, temporary technology. So just expect the technology to change and expect it to get better.
Yeah, I look forward to our fall grazing, seeing how that turns out with our targeted grazing on the cheatgrass. I look forward to working with our new permittees this summer for a different sort of project with virtual fence. They're going to be new to it, so it's going to be some learning all around again. And you know, in the future, if there's more permittees that approach us, we're just looking forward to seeing what sort of ideas people come up with.
All kinds of ideas after today, right? Sean and Brian, do you have anything you're curious about or kind of wanting how it'll shake out in the next year?
I'll let you go, Sean.
Yes, our house has poor and limited cell phone service in a lot of for our national forest areas, and that's one of the components that makes this system work well. So we're curious of the ways to either get service to the towers or to have the callers talk to each other, but that seems to be the thing where the system didn't work well this year is so how to improve the capacity by new technology.
Brian?
You know, I don't have a whole lot. I'm hoping that we have just more adopters, you know, more permittees that want to take this on and expand it. We're still building fence, and a lot of folks are still building fence out there on the ground, and it's expensive and it takes a lot of effort and it's not always foolproof. So I hope we have some more permittees that are interested in heading this direction.
Yeah, thank you both. Dan, I'll give you the last word. Anything you're looking forward to?
So the smart aleck answer is no. I think we're at a point where we would just like a little bit of routine, right? We've been 2 years learning the technology, putting the towers in, which in our area is really difficult. But I think we're at a point where we just want to lean in and use the technology better. We're currently training all of our folks so that anybody's pretty comfortable with it. But for a little bit, we're okay with not a lot of change.
So what I'm hearing is you don't want to be curious about anything new. We appreciate the honesty. So we have a little over 10 minutes. And so questions from the room, online. You have your in-person panelists here. We also have the folks up on the screen along the lines of partnering. Keeping in mind, just after this, we'll hear a bit about some funding opportunities.
All right, we're going to try this. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Okay. My question, and it relates to, I mean, graze on a permit as well, forest. The use of the technology is great. But one of the things that I'm seeing that's limiting, at least in our situation sometimes, is water development. And that's been a huge one, at least for me, is the standpoint of there's a belief that the technology is going to allow you to graze these uplands better so they won't go down to the riparian. But they're not going to be up there without water or enough groceries to keep them. I'm curious if y'all have seen that, and if it is, because I know it's something that we probably should have been doing a long time already about water development, but to me, it's bringing that kind of management and cooperation potentially with the AOIs and everything else of how are we going to get better grazing distribution, because there's more to it. It's like what we talked about earlier on how cattle are moving across the landscape. Depending on the size of that pasture and how it works, to me, the water development is a huge key that I think not only the development of what's known, but do we know where all the potential water developments are? And I'm just curious thoughts on that and how you see that fit within this technology moving forward as it relates to better management, better grazing distribution.
Well, you're right on, Dave. I know two places I'm just planning on putting solar wells. As it goes forward, I'm sure there'll be more of that. And I'm pretty fortunate. On my BLM, my dad was an early adopter and he was real active. I've got 18 pastures and water probably between every half mile and mile with the developments. We got clay ground that if you get some snow, it'll run. But no, I think the solar wells, you're going to see a lot of those. I don't think you'll see too many on my BLM. I've got two 540-foot post holes out there. But no, water's going to come right along with the change in the grazing.
I think Luke would agree. For us, the limiting factor is water, right? And I see elders shaking their head. We can do a lot with fence, but we can't fence them in where we don't have water. And for us, most of these allotments we're running on are new tests. And then on the one that burned, we've got issues with spring developments, et cetera, that burned up. That's where we're going to lean in is trying to get the water in shape. Where you have really good water, as Brian and Sean mentioned, we have steelhead and bull trout, and we aren't supposed to water there. And so we use the technology actually to fence them out of water.
Sure. I wonder if Roger or Herb, has water been part of the discussions with all the different producers you're working there? I know you have a lot of private land out there.
Yeah, I think, it's definitely going to be one of the first things that we're talking about. And, luckily we have, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board small grant program. Should there be, undeveloped water, we can work with the producers to maybe do some spring developments or use NRCS cost share. But I think, that's same with us. It's all it hinges around water in these pastures.
Thanks for that question. Do we have any online?
All right, we'll see if someone can answer this one. After the 2024 fire season, traditional fence building has had to be rebuilt in the exact same location per FSA funding for our county producers. Otherwise, it needs a cultural survey to build a new location, which is restricted by money and professional archaeological availability. I assume the virtual fence technology would eliminate this need for a cultural survey, or would the tower installation need it if it is a permanent location? Can anyone speak to this?
We could probably try, or I'll let you go, or I can go first. How's that sound? Yeah, if we don't disturb the ground, we don't do any heritage or archaeological surveys. And the tower sits on the surface, and so we haven't had to consider heritage or archaeology. You probably don't want to put that tower in a cultural site, so that's one thing to think about. But otherwise we haven't really had to address it like you would with a traditional fence.
Okay. You've reminded me of a question we didn't get to. Permitting to have towers on public land. Is that something you had to learn about, Lindsay?
So we didn't have to do any extra permitting because we're not installing them on the ground. We do have them on top of trailers. We're not doing any ground disturbance, so we didn't have to do any extra permitting.
Same in your office, Forest Service?
Yeah, exactly. All of this is, wouldn't trigger a lengthy NEPA review because of those reasons.
Thanks for that question online. Did you guys answer all the questions?
So as a researcher, we see lots of data and we look at that. I'm curious how, one thing we haven't heard is how you've used the animals to affect grazing distribution, but how are you going to use, are any of you using the data that you're downloading from those collars? And if you are, how are you using it moving forward?
That would have been a better question for Luke, but I'll stumble through it. So we actually, Luke and I were on a call day before yesterday. We're using Maya grazing. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. It's, if you heard of Pasture Map, Maya's, I think it's New Zealand based, but they're actually, our contact is going to use our heat maps to actually help with our grazing planning going into this next year. I'm going a little bit beyond that, but Luke and I were talking about it on the way up here this morning, and the BLM and Forest Service folks can talk, but it seems like there's really limited staffing, in terms of our monitoring, and we've just decided we're gonna have to do our own monitoring, right? And in coordination with the agencies, but I think that's one of the things that the heat maps, the grazing history that we can produce by having the database that Vents, for instance, supplies us with, is going to help us saying, yeah, no, we know where our cattle were on this date, and the disturbance you're seeing maybe in a riparian is probably elk, for instance. But yeah, it's really cool to see this being incorporated with our grazing planning software, which for us is Maya.
Is that something you would submit to your permittee file with the Forest Service, or is that for your own use, for the ranch's use?
So this is going a little bit beyond, but we're working with a company called Northway Ranch Services, which I heard someone mention Sustainable Northwest. Northway Ranch Services works with Sustainable Northwest. Sustainable Northwest and Northway has worked with our ranch. They've developed an app specifically for our permits where we now have all of our U.S. Forest Service monitoring locations on an app. And again, I'm not the best one to talk about this. Luke or Sean would be, but then the criteria for monitoring at those spots is on that app. So now we can send our folks, or Luke or I can go, takes us exactly to the spot we need to monitor for the Forest Service. It has the criteria, the stream back alteration, stubble height, all of those things are in this app. We plug it in. It now lives in the cloud. We really haven't gone the next step to talk to the Forest Service, although Sean helped us locate all of the monitoring spots, so he's well aware of what we're doing. But you're going to have to ask Sean how this meets or addresses their need for monitoring. But we think it's just important for us to do as a permittee.
John, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going over my grazing data yesterday, and of course, I'm at a way smaller scale and doing a short-term landscape treatment. So the things Dan talked about don't necessarily come up. But what I was going to do, I was go back through my grazing data, find these cattle that are escaping, identify them, and remove them and replace them with cows that stay in, so I can do more effective land treatments.
Yeah, thanks, John. Sean, did you want to add to what Dan shared a moment ago?
Yes, so we can accept Dan's monitoring data. There is some things that we need to do first, and maybe they've done already, about them ensuring they know or they're monitoring the same way that we monitor and in the same place, and some kind of data quality assurance. But I think there's even an agreement with the Public Lands Council about third-party monitoring that would allow almost all ranchers to collect their own data and then to use that in their decision-making process.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just squeeze in my last question. So Gillum, SWCD, I see we have a couple watershed councils, other SWCDs in the room. Is there any advice you would give to other county-based organizations like those?
Yeah, I think it's, we, talking in our shop, getting the word out about the technology, efforts like this, is the best way to get started. And then, working with your funders and your partners, like, working with Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, maybe develop, an open solicitation grant, to get some of your equipment, or even a technical assistance grant to start planning. And then, mention partners, just working with your local NRCS, district conservationist, or Joe Klein, trying to get an idea of what it would need, to get producers up and running, talking with, folks on this call, to get as, as knowledgeable on the technologies you can to help relay that information, to producers. And yeah, I think the biggest thing is just, making sure that your producers are informed, and, develop partnerships to get the information out there. And then like what we're trying to do is make sure we have enough resources locally to answer any questions that might come up throughout the process, and make sure we have the right folks with the right know-how. And then, like I said, looking for your typical funding sources, to try to help you meet your objectives. And it sounds like in the next section of this, so we'll be talking about that some, but those are really kind of high level things that I would say would be a good place to start. Did I miss anything, Roger? No, I think that's it.
Well, thank you too. I like that we ended on a positive note. I'd like to thank our panelists, John O'Keefe, Lindsay Smith, Dan Probert, Herb Winters, Roger Lathrop, Sean Mork, and Brian Anderson. Thank you all for helping out, sharing what you've learned so far. And for the rest of you here online, you can find these people. We're going to aim to end a little bit early, so you have time to seek out these folks and ask any follow-up questions you have. So thank you, guys. The final section is kind of looking ahead. And so we are really lucky to be joined by two people from the Natural Resource Conservation Service. I will invite them up now and load up your presentation. And so we'll hear from them about specific cost share programs that the NRCS is offering. But then we're going to kind of transition the conversation to just more generally future opportunities. I didn't say their names. So we are joined by Heather Murphy, who is the NRCS Rangeland Management Specialist out of Union County and designated basin lead for range practices in the John Day Umatilla Basin. And also Joe Klein, who I think a lot of you know, the Basin Resource Conservationist for the John Day Umatilla Basin. Thank you both for being here today.
Hello, as she said, I'm Heather. Stepping into the basin lead role. So this is definitely a learning experience for me, taking some things off of Joe's plate. So it'd be great to connect with some of y'all later. But essentially, we are just here to give you a brief overview of what the NRCS can cost share on, and kind of how you can go about finding that funding. Next slide. Oh, wait, it's right in front of me. Down there. Okay, so for virtual fence right now, we can only plan it if it's in a boundary that has a permanent fence. So it has to be within that. And for all permanent fences, they have to be up to NRCS specifications, and you can pick our brains later about what that is if you are not sure. And we also have to have traditional fences that are still there to exclude livestock from areas that are mandatory to keep them out if you have land in CRP or CREP or any other things. And if you were selected for a contract, which is, if you would be selected for a contract, that's how you would get the cost share. Then you would be responsible for training your livestock to use the virtual fence system you're using before you actually implement it. And that would just be following the guidelines that from the manufacturer that you're using specifically. And you can use cost share, or we can cost share on systems that are based on cell signal or single or multiple base stations. And if you're using a base station, you would just have to keep it protected from your livestock so they don't rub on it and protect it. So we break up our cost share into 2 different practices at the moment. So for year 1, it would be planned under our fence practice, and it has a higher cost share just to help defray the costs of getting started. And all of our cost share for this is based on a per animal basis, and we have 4 different scenarios that would be how we would decide what cost share you would be eligible for. So less than 50 animals is the largest cost share, and then if you have sheep or goats, that one's also higher, and then it just kind of goes down in numbers from there. And then for our years 2 through 5, that would be planned under prescribed grazing. And once again, it's a per animal cost share. And that's just to help with the ongoing maintenance of your system and also to implement the grazing plan that would be part of the contract. And our cost shares are annual. So right now, this is for our fiscal year 2025, and they typically can y'all, ooh, there we go. They typically change from year to year, so you could just check in with your local office to see what that is going to be for the year you are applying for.
All right, so I'm just going to go through a few different ways that we might be able to fund some of these projects with producers. Something to keep in mind, if you've got more questions on this later, we can dig into them. We work with private landowners on private lands primarily, but there might be some opportunities where we could work together with producers who operate on both public and private land. We've got these acronyms that I've got up here: EQIP, RCPP, IRA. Those are just different funding mechanisms that may be available. And if this is something that you're interested in, I recommend that you go into your local office and apply at any time. There we go. And apply now if this is something that you're interested in. Start the conversation. The application deadline is usually in November every year, but if you put it off, I don't know how many times I've worked with a producer who puts it off, and they miss the application deadline and they're waiting another year. So if it's on your mind, just go ahead, go down to your local office and start the conversation. And as you've heard from some of the panelists today, it's also probably a good idea to start your conversation with the vendors early to try to figure out which system might meet your needs the best. We heard from a couple different people, and maybe one outfit will provide the product you want, but the other one's not going to meet your needs. The funding, the exact mechanisms, that's going to vary based on your location. So in Oregon, we've got funds for this type of stuff that are limited to a specific geography. So maybe if you're in Harney County, we've got this fund pool available. If you're in Malheur County, it might be something else. Really, the best thing to do is go just check in with your local office and see what your options are. I've got a slide that kind of covers that coming up, but if you're not familiar, you can just Google it, and it shouldn't be too hard to figure out where your office is. At least get a phone number so you can reach out, start answering some of these questions. A couple things to think in mind, or to keep in mind. If you're already participating with NRCS, the Farm Service Agency, you want to make sure this might conflict with something you're already doing. So say you've got some acres that are signed up in CRP grasslands. The rules there, if you sign up for that, is you aren't eligible for any other NRCS programs, so you can't do this. Maybe you're already doing prescribed grazing through the Conservation Stewardship Program or something else. Well, this you won't be able to do this at the same time because you're already you're already in a contract to do a grazing plan. which is essentially what half of this is. You know, that first year, we're treating it like it's a fence. So that may not be a conflict, but then if you're trying to, for those out years to maintain it, to keep implementing your grazing plan, to pay the rental rates on the collars, if you're already doing a grazing plan, there's a conflict there. We can't pay for the same thing twice on the same acres. So just some things to think about. And with that,
And just if you don't know how to find your local office, you can just type in NRCS office, and then that first link, Service Center Locator, will be how you can find specifically where you can go and the specific people to talk to. And if you guys have any further questions, please reach out to the Department of Defense. Or you can ask them now.
you're going to shuttle it. Are we down to one microphone?
We think so.
This is probably easier, then we don't have to go back.
Yeah, no, I was just curious. So in the application process, do you have to put how you plan to graze, like the land?
So not at the time of application. What we kind of want to have a feel for before you apply is what is the concern? Because really what what the NRCS, like the benefit that our agency is seeking from it is we're treating some kind of resource concern you might have. So maybe with a virtual fence, you'll be able to manage your rangeland better. And that's really what we're getting at, is you want to implement a new grazing system. Maybe you're trying to protect some sensitive areas. So that's what we want to have a feel for early on, but that's just a part of our process. When you start that conversation with your local office early, like if you do it now, we can start figuring some of those things out. We can go out and visit with you when the weather's appropriate, maybe in the summer if it's inaccessible now. Gather that information and start coming up with a plan. But to apply, you don't need to have all that figured out. That's a part of our planning process as we go on through it. So before you have a contract, there should be a pretty good plan for what you're doing. But at the point of application, really you just need to know that there's something you're concerned about and some pretty basic information. But the earlier you come in, the more of the stuff we can figure out before we're up against those deadlines.
All right, we do have a question, whoa, online. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me online. All right, so the question that we have is, how long does it take to receive the collars and towers from these virtual fence companies? Is there a wait list? Should producers sign up in advance? And I do know we have Emily Fowler with Halter online, but you are the
I would lean on a vendor to answer that.
And we have Nathaniel, who's going to be speaking up on this.
Yeah, so I can only speak for events. It depends on the season. Spring is often our busiest season, but a typical lead time for collars is 2 weeks from the time of order. Base stations take a little bit longer to deliver, up to 6 weeks. So give yourself that period of time to plan ahead. And so anyway.
And something I might tack onto that from our perspective, starting that conversation with the vendor early to get a feel for the availability is, once we get to a contract with us, you want to make sure it's something that you can implement. And part of that is making sure that you've got access to whatever vendors' products that you need. So, if everybody signed up for one vendor all at the same time and they couldn't meet the demand, you wouldn't be able to fulfill your contract. So that is another advantage to starting the conversation early with your vendors to get a feel for, okay, if I get this contract, are you going to have products available to send to me? And so that we can implement this whole plan that we're coming up with. So another reason to talk to the vendors early is to make sure that they can meet your needs at a reasonable timeline.
All right, Joe, another question. Can these cost share programs be applied to federal lands?
There we go. So the way to think about this, so say the base station portion that we're treating like a fence, if that's getting located on public land, that's not going to be compatible with our programs. But say you're locating it on your property, it's private land, and that base station will serve you both on your private property and also on your adjacent permit, potentially that can work. And then if we're thinking about just the collars, which we're addressing more like a grazing plan, What we're really concerned about is the private acres that you are implementing this grazing plan on, and say you need 400 collars to do that. If those animals are out on your public allotment for the summer, that doesn't matter so long as you're following the grazing plan that we come up with for your private acres. So these things can work together. We may not directly be paying for these collars or these base stations or whatever infrastructure may be necessary. We may not be directly paying for that on public acres, but that doesn't mean it can't be complementary. So if you've got adjacent private and public permits, there is potential for these things to work together, and the collars are an easy one. You know, if you're using them at home and you're using them on your public ground, so long as you're following the plan at home, it can be the same colors. You don't have to take them off when you leave or anything like that.
All right, so this is a follow-up from Connor. Is the virtual fence allowed on NRCS easements? Does it work through a CUA?
So that person must be talking about wetland easements. And if grazing is allowed and if fence is allowed, there shouldn't be any restrictions there. Now, the cost share portion of it is a different story. That, you know, that might be one of those things where that's a pretty specific case. And so that if there's a particular project in mind, they should reach out to their easement specialist to make sure there's no contradictions. I can't imagine any unusual restriction to the use of that technology. Whether or not we could pay for it is a different question. And they would, like, say this is a wetland easement that's a protected wetland. They still need to make sure that the grazing plan is in line with the objectives of that easement.
Well, thank you, Joe and Heather, for sharing this really new information, a couple months old, right? This is exciting. So these two are going to stick around until the top of the hour. So thank you both for being here. The next bit of time, we have just over 20 minutes. You know, if anyone had questions about other funding opportunities, and so we heard from Dan a couple other creative sources of funding. Some of those surprised me. Does anyone have either funding sources that they've explored or known about and want to share with the group? Or do you have questions about other funding sources at this point? Nathaniel in the back.
So first of all, there are other independent funding sources. There's a group called PERC, and don't ask me what the acronym stands for because I forgot. But anyway, that if you look online, PERC Virtual Fence Fund, you should be able to find it if you Google it. Another thing, how many folks do we have here from Idaho? Do we have any here? Okay. So Idaho is just starting to launch a Grazing Improvement Act, they call it. I believe if you go to the State Department of Ag website and look for Grazing Improvement Act, you should be able to find a website there. Now, they're in the process of still funding that program, but it is they're basing it and modeling it after the Utah Grazing Improvement Program, which has been around for at least 10 years now. And they've provided many valuable resources to producers in that state. In terms of cost share, but also all sorts of support programs, mediation programs. If you're having trouble working with, let's say, your agency, or you're being pressured by an environmental group, I don't know if Idaho's up to speed with that, but Utah provides those kind of supports for producers, and there's I think some really wonderful things to look forward to in Idaho, and I hope it spreads to Oregon and Washington as well. So anyway, wanted to share that. Katie?
Thanks, Nathaniel. It sounds like we might be hearing from Halter online.
All right, so for Emily, do you want to unmute? Emily is one of the Halter representatives. And Emily, are you able to unmute? And would you like to provide information from Halter? All right, well, similar to events, it depends based on their collar availability at at the time. Usually the lead time should be around 6 to 8 weeks. Thank you very much, Emily.
So last chance for questions to the room at large, and then I propose we break a little bit early and you all get a chance to mingle, maybe ask that one weird question that maybe you didn't want to ask in front of the group. But this is your last opportunity. Any questions for the good of the order? All right. Well, thank you all for coming today. You guys help make this a place where we can learn by asking really good questions and engaging. Thank you to those online for hanging in there with the audio. And we appreciate your time today, and have snacks, meet each other, chat, and thanks again.